The Vietnam War, a conflict spanning 2 decades, did not commence with the resounding crash of bombs or the chaotic charge of battlefields. Its origins were subtle, brewing in hushed meetings and whispered conversations within a distant jungle, a land largely unknown to most Americans, yet destined to profoundly shape a generation's essence. This was a war devoid of clear triumphs or definitive adversaries, lacking any semblance of a clean conclusion. It was waged across the verdant rice paddies and the dense rainforests, within bustling cities and murky swamps, and most significantly, within the very minds of those who endured it. Presidents spoke of peace, generals pursued elusive specters, and soldiers confronted an enemy that often remained shrouded in invisibility. Some combatants fought to halt the march of communism, while others yearned to break free from the shackles of foreign dominion. Ultimately, no one emerged from this conflict unscathed. This is not merely the chronicle of a war, but rather an exploration of its profound impact on the world and on the lives of those who lived through its tumultuous chapters, how it began, and how it ultimately unraveled. Chapter 1. Echoes of Empire. For nearly a century, Vietnam was not its own sovereign entity. It languished under the dominion of another flag, that of France. The French arrived not as welcomed guests, but as conquerors, armed with weaponry and naval vessels, proclaiming a mission to civilize a land they perceived as untamed. They christened it Indochine, a fragment of their vast Asian empire, seized by force and maintained through intimidation. Yet beneath the veneer of everyday existence in the rice paddies, the mountains, and the winding city alleys, a formidable resistance quietly began to stir, growing from a whisper to a roar. To truly grasp the Vietnam War, one must journey back to the 1800s, when French soldiers first trod upon Vietnamese soil and decided to establish a lasting presence. France transformed Vietnam into a colony, governing through appointed officials. They constructed railways, ports, and plantations, not for the benefit of the Vietnamese populace, but for their own economic gain. Rubber, rice, and coal were systematically extracted and shipped away to fuel the burgeoning French Empire. The Vietnamese laborers toiled under arduous conditions, poverty was widespread, and many succumbed to starvation. While the French erected magnificent edifices in Hanoi and Saigon, the majority of the local populace resided in modest dwellings, barely eking out an existence. Schools did exist, but they predominantly served the French elite and a select few Vietnamese individuals groomed to serve the colonial administration. Nevertheless, an insidious notion, perilous to colonial rule, was steadily taking root: the concept of freedom, the conviction that Vietnam could claim its own destiny. At the vanguard of this aspiration stood a man named Nguyen Sinh Cung, later globally recognized as Ho Chi Minh. His journeys had taken him across the world, to France, the Soviet Union, and even the United States, where he observed both the rise and fall of empires. He delved into the philosophy of revolution, firm in his belief that Vietnam need not passively await liberty but must seize it. While Ho Chi Minh espoused communism, to the vast majority of Vietnamese, he transcended mere political ideology. He embodied their suffering, their aspirations, and their fervent yearning for dignity. The opportune moment for Vietnam's bid for freedom arrived during World War II. As France found itself debilitated and under Nazi occupation. In Asia, Japan launched its own invasion, seizing control of Vietnam while permitting the French to retain a nominal presence. For the Vietnamese, this merely signified the replacement of one foreign oppressor with another. It was then that Ho Chi Minh and his burgeoning movement, the Viet Minh, rose to prominence. Comprised of farmers wielding rifles and students fueled by dreams, they waged a guerrilla war against the Japanese, employing clandestine tactics, striking from the depths of the forests at night and vanishing by dawn. By 1945, with Japan's surrender marking the conclusion of World War II, the Viet Minh stood ready. They boldly proclaimed independence in Hanoi. Ho Chi Minh, addressing a vast assembly, delivered a declaration that echoed the resonant words of Thomas Jefferson. "All men are created equal. For a fleeting moment, it appeared that Vietnam would at last embrace its freedom. However, true liberty remained elusive. France, resolute in its determination to reclaim what it considered its colony, swiftly returned. They vehemently refused to acknowledge Vietnam's independence, diplomatic talks faltered, and weaponry was readied. Thus, in 1946, a new conflict ignited, the First Indochina War. This was no longer solely about Vietnam. It was a desperate struggle between empires desperately clinging to their vestiges of power and revolutions striving to break free. The French possessed tanks, aircraft, and foreign backing, while the Viet Minh commanded the land, the unwavering support of the people, and an unyielding resolve. The war was characterized by its brutal intensity. Cities were subjected to relentless bombing. Villages were consumed by flames, and families were torn asunder. Yet the Viet Minh steadfastly refused to capitulate. Recognizing their inability to achieve victory in conventional, open warfare, they adapted their tactics. They launched attacks from the impenetrable depths of the jungle, transforming the very terrain into their staunch ally, effectively turning the French's strengths into crippling weaknesses. Then came 1954. In the remote northwestern reaches of Vietnam, nestled within a valley encircled by hills, the French opted for their definitive stand, a place known as Dien Bien Phu. The French were convinced of its impregnability, deeming it easily defensible and difficult to access. They erected a formidable fortress, airdropping thousands of soldiers and supplies, certain they would ensnare the Viet Minh in a decisive trap. However, they had gravely miscalculated. The Viet Minh, under the sagacious command of General Vo Nguyen Giap, accomplished the inconceivable. They meticulously moved tens of thousands of troops through treacherous terrain, hauling artillery pieces, some by hand, over towering mountains. Inch by agonizing inch, they dug intricate trenches, drawing ever closer. They constructed a labyrinthine network of tunnels, effectively encircling Dien Bien Phu like a tightening noose. The French remained oblivious to the impending doom, and by the time the initial shells descended, it was already irrevocably too late. For nearly 2 months, the siege raged relentlessly. Rain deluged the landscape, turning the ground into a thick, clinging mud. Attempts to resupply by air were met with anti-aircraft fire, and planes were shot down. French soldiers found themselves trapped, their morale steadily eroding. One by one, their strategic positions crumbled. On May 7, 1954, the French fortress ultimately capitulated, with thousands surrendering. This was more than a mere military defeat, it signaled the irreversible demise of France's colonial empire in Asia. The world observed with bated breath. In Geneva, global powers convened to determine Vietnam's future. A line was hastily drawn, not with meticulous precision, but with the expediency of political maneuvering, effectively bisecting the country. Vietnam was split into 2 entities: North Vietnam, under the control of Ho Chi Minh and the Communists, and South Vietnam, supported by Western powers and led by anti-communist politicians. This division was intended to be temporary, with promises of elections to follow. Yet those elections never materialized. The North diligently prepared for reunification, while the South endeavored to establish a new government, bolstered by financial aid and weaponry from America. Nevertheless, beneath the surface, tensions simmered. One war had concluded, but another was stealthily, inexorably, beginning. Chapter 2. A Nation Divided. When the cannons at Dien Bien Phu finally ceased their roar, the French understood that their era was over. Their Southeast Asian empire had imploded. For Vietnam, this should have heralded the dawn of freedom. Instead, it became the genesis of something far more precarious and perilous. In July 1954, world powers convened in Geneva, Switzerland. Diplomats from France, Britain, China, the Soviet Union, and the United States gathered around the negotiating table. North Vietnam sent its representatives, while South Vietnam notably did not. The assembly, christened the Geneva Conference, aimed to cease hostilities throughout Indochina, not just in Vietnam, but also in Laos and Cambodia. In truth, however, the conference revolved around control, influence, and the escalating Cold War. The global landscape was no longer a simple dichotomy of East versus West. It was a stark confrontation between communism and capitalism, where every nation that shifted allegiance represented either a victory or a defeat in this expanding worldwide game. Vietnam emerged as the ultimate prize. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh had achieved a significant triumph at Dien Bien Phu, but they had not yet fully secured the nation. Their objective remained straightforward: complete independence and reunification, a single Vietnam governed by a single authority. Yet, this profound aspiration would be postponed by political machinations, pervasive fear, and external pressures. At Geneva, the major powers were consumed by mutual distrust. The West harbored fears that if Vietnam entirely succumbed to communist rule, neighboring countries, Laos, Cambodia, and potentially even Thailand, would inevitably follow suit. This was the widely recognized domino theory: if one nation fell, the others would topple in succession. Consequently, a compromise was forged: Vietnam would be provisionally divided. Not by geographical features like mountains or rivers, but by an arbitrary line, the 17th parallel. North of this demarcation, Ho Chi Minh and the Communists would govern the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, while south of it, a non-communist government would be established, later designated the Republic of Vietnam. This was explicitly not a final resolution, it was intended to be temporary. Both factions consented to national elections in 1956, merely 2 years hence, allowing the Vietnamese populace to determine their own destiny: one vote, one country, one Vietnam. However, that pivotal election never transpired, and in that broken promise, the very seeds of war were sown. In the north, Ho Chi Minh embarked on the arduous task of national reconstruction. His government operated with discipline, strictness, and an unyielding resolve. He instituted land reforms, re-educated former adversaries, and laid the groundwork for a unified socialist Vietnam. Life was undeniably challenging, but for many in the north, the sacrifices were deemed worthwhile. They had fought for independence, and now they were constructing a new societal order. In stark contrast, the situation in the South remained considerably less stable. The individual selected to lead was No Dinh Diem, a Catholic nationalist in a predominantly Buddhist nation. He was fiercely anti-communist, highly educated, and deeply conservative. The United States perceived Diem as the most viable hope for containing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, and thus provided him with financial assistance, training, and weaponry. Diem swiftly consolidated power, but not through democratic processes. He ruthlessly crushed his rivals, refused to conduct the promised elections, and following a rigged referendum in 1955, declared himself president of the Republic of Vietnam. Ballots were manipulated, opposition was silenced, and in some areas, the number of yes votes astonishingly surpassed the number of registered voters. Despite these irregularities, the United States continued to endorse him. President Eisenhower later conceded that had elections been held in 1956, Ho Chi Minh would have easily secured victory, potentially by an overwhelming margin of 80% or more. This prospect deeply alarmed the West, who believed that a communist Vietnam would diminish American influence in Asia. Consequently, they prioritized stability over fairness and control over popular consent, inadvertently choosing conflict by aligning with Diem. Diem governed with an iron fist, trusting only his immediate family and a small cadre of elites. He ruthlessly suppressed political dissent, outlawing communist parties, imprisoning critics, and silencing Buddhist leaders. He termed his actions protection, others labeled it repression. In the rural areas, thousands who had once supported the Viet Minh now faced relentless harassment. Villages that had valiantly resisted the French now found themselves resisting Diem's regime. Meanwhile, in the north, Ho Chi Minh observed these developments with keen interest. The prospect of peaceful reunification dwindled, replaced by the nascent formation of a new strategy. To reunify Vietnam not through elections, but through force. The North initiated covert support for communist sympathizers in the South. These factions would subsequently become known as the Viet Cong, a shortened term for Vietnamese communists. They were not exclusively trained soldiers. Many were ordinary farmers, teachers, and laborers, incensed by the Diem regime and desperate for change. They issued uniforms, moving stealthily through the jungles and villages, concealing themselves by day and launching attacks by night. Their weaponry was rudimentary, but their resolve was fierce. They were not merely battling Diem. They were fighting for the aspiration of a unified Vietnam. To the South Vietnamese government and their American benefactors, these rebels were terrorists. To others, they were valiant freedom fighters. By the late 1950s, the conflict was steadily intensifying. Ambushes, assassinations, and bombings became increasingly commonplace, rendering the roads perilous. American military advisors arrived to assist in training South Vietnamese troops. Initially, their presence remained in the background, but their numbers steadily swelled. What had originated as a civil conflict was inexorably transforming into something larger. Simultaneously, the Diem government became increasingly isolated. His fixation on loyalty blinded him to the pervasive suffering of his own people. He overtly favored Catholic allies, largely disregarding the needs of the Buddhist majority. In 1963, when Buddhist monks initiated protests against his discriminatory policies, Diem responded with unbridled violence. In one of the most profoundly shocking moments of the early war, a Buddhist monk named Viet Cong calmly seated himself in the middle of a bustling Saigon street, doused himself in gasoline, and self-immolated. He remained motionless, uttered no cry, burning in silent protest against Diem's egregious brutality. The image reverberated across the globe, stunning the world. Diem had irretrievably forfeited the trust of his populace, and gradually, he also lost the confidence of the United States. Later that same year, South Vietnamese generals orchestrated a coup, with implicit support from the U.S., overthrowing Diem. He was subsequently arrested and assassinated. This marked a pivotal turning point, not solely for South Vietnam, but for America as well, because without Diem, the South lacked a strong leader. And the North remained poised, watchful, and preparing. The Geneva Accords had been violated, the promised elections never materialized, and the provisional line at the 17th parallel had solidified into a tangible border, symbolizing a nation fractured. Yet, Vietnam was never intended to be two distinct countries. Neither in its historical narrative nor in its deeply held national identity. The North steadfastly clung to the aspiration of reunification, while the South remained consumed by the fear of invasion. Caught in this agonizing geopolitical vice were millions of ordinary citizens, farmers, students, mothers, soldiers, who simply yearned for peace. But peace was no longer a viable option. America found itself more deeply embroiled than ever before. Advisors had transitioned into decision-makers, and support had transmuted into strategic imperatives. War was no longer a question of if, but when. The trajectory towards full-scale conflict was now unmistakably wide open. Chapter 3: Seeds of Insurgency. Following the downfall of Ngo Dinh Diem, South Vietnam plunged into a maelstrom of confusion. The streets of Saigon hummed with tension, the government was rudderless, and a dozen generals vied for control. Coup followed coup, with power shifting like grains of sand in a relentless wind. Washington observed with palpable nervousness, a belated realization dawning that the South, the very nation America had pledged to safeguard, was considerably more fragile than anyone had previously acknowledged. Yet, this chapter of the narrative does not commence in the bustling capital. It begins far from the clamor of headlines, in the tranquil rice fields, the labyrinthine jungles, and the unassuming villages where the true conflict was silently, steadily, taking shape. The Viet Minh, the the battle-hardened fighters who had once bravely confronted the French did not simply vanish after the Geneva Accord bisected Vietnam in 1954. Many returned to their homes in the north, but a significant number remained in the south. Some meticulously concealed their weaponry, others buried their radios, and some simply awaited the opportune moment. When the promised elections failed to materialize, they began to stir. What started as hushed whispers transmuted into clandestine meetings, and quiet resistance evolved into decisive action. This new generation of combatants in the South christened themselves the National Liberation Front, though the world would come to recognize them by a different moniker, the Viet Cong. They were not a conventional army. They possessed no tanks, uniforms, or sprawling military bases. Yet they possessed something equally potent, a compelling cause. They fervently believed that the South Vietnamese government was endemically corrupt, beholden to foreign powers, and deaf to the legitimate grievances of its own populace. They perceived themselves as liberators. The Viet Cong operated in the shadows, utilizing the dense jungle as their impenetrable shield. They wore no distinctive insignias. One moment they were seemingly ordinary farmers, the next they transformed into formidable soldiers. They strategically planted bombs on roads, ambushed convoys, assaulted outposts, and then seamlessly melted back into the enveloping darkness of the night. They systematically assassinated South Vietnamese officials, mayors, policemen, anyone perceived as a compliant puppet of the regime. Initially, their ranks were modest, but as Diem's rule grew increasingly authoritarian and his repression deepened, more and more individuals joined their cause. Some were motivated by sheer indignation, others by utter desperation, and some simply because they had nothing left to lose. Meanwhile, in the north, Ho Chi Minh and his preeminent commander, General Vo Nguyen Giap, watched the unfolding events with intense scrutiny. They became convinced that reunification could no longer be achieved through peaceful means. The South would never permit an election, and the Americans would never tolerate a communist triumph. Consequently, the North began to actively support the escalating insurgency in the South, not through overt military deployments, but through a clandestine network of roads, trails, and silent couriers. This marked the genesis of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was not a singular thoroughfare but an intricate labyrinth of jungle paths, snaking through the territories of Laos and Cambodia, weaving around mountains and rivers. Supplies, weaponry, and soldiers flowed ceaselessly down this trail, day and night, transported by hand, by bicycle, and by pack animals, all meticulously concealed beneath the thick canopies of the forest, rendered invisible from the sky. It stood as one of the most ambitious logistical networks ever conceived, and the United States would expend years attempting, and ultimately failing, to dismantle it. While the North meticulously prepared for war, they were simultaneously undertaking a profound societal transformation at home. In the early 1950s, Ho Chi Minh initiated a sweeping land reform campaign. The fundamental concept was straightforward: confiscate land from affluent landlords and redistribute it to the peasantry. This initiative was intended to be revolutionary, a means to empower the impoverished and dismantle the antiquated feudal system. However, in practice, its implementation proved brutal. Landowners were summarily branded as class enemies, public trials were conducted, accusations proliferated, and thousands were executed. Many more were imprisoned or forcibly evicted from their ancestral homes. While some victims were indeed guilty of cruelty, others were targeted out of envy or old grievances. The campaign left indelible scars, tearing families apart and fracturing villages. Even staunch communists began to voice misgivings regarding the severity of these policies. Eventually, Ho Chi Minh acknowledged that errors had been made, and he scaled back the reforms, with some officials facing punishment. Yet the damage had been inflicted. Nevertheless, for a significant number of impoverished farmers, the land reforms had a lasting, transformative impact. For the first time, they possessed ownership of the very soil they tilled, providing them with a compelling reason to fight not just for the revolution, but for their own small parcel of Vietnam. In the South, the landscape presented a starkly different tableau. Diem had also pledged to enact land ownership reforms, but little substantive change materialized. Large landlords retained their expansive estates, rent remained exorbitant, and impoverished farmers languished in perpetual debt, toiling on land they would never own. Some harbored hopes for governmental assistance, while others increasingly lent an ear to the Viet Cong's message. The U.S. endeavored to assist Diem in establishing a stable South Vietnam, dispatching aid, weaponry, and military advisors. They provided training to South Vietnamese troops and oversaw the construction of airfields and roads. However, they proved incapable of rectifying the underlying issue. Diem lacked the genuine trust of his own people. He governed from behind fortified walls, surrounded by a coterie of loyalists. His secret police systematically arrested critics, and his army exhibited loyalty more to specific individuals than to the nation itself. Corruption permeated every stratum of society. Furthermore, Diem evinced a profound lack of understanding regarding the rural villages where the majority of Vietnamese resided, viewing them as mere territories to be controlled rather than communities deserving of support. Consequently, he initiated a program called Agraville, which forcibly relocated villagers into government-controlled camps. This initiative was intended to insulate them from the Viet Cong, but paradoxically, it merely alienated them further and pushed them closer to the insurgency. By the late 1950s, Viet Cong attacks were escalating, with ambushes becoming routine and assassinations growing in frequency. In 1959, American soldiers were killed in Vietnam for the first time. 2 military advisors shot at a base near Bien Hoa. It was a minor incident in the grand scheme, but a profoundly deadly one. More troops swiftly followed, and by 1960, the U.S. maintained nearly 1,000 military advisors in South Vietnam. President Eisenhower cautioned his successor, John F. Kennedy, that Southeast Asia teetered on the brink of peril. He articulated that if Vietnam succumbed to communism, other nations, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and even Indonesia, would inevitably follow. Kennedy accepted this assessment. He had campaigned as a resolute cold warrior, a president committed to steadfastly opposing the spread of communism. Consequently, upon assuming office, he amplified America's commitment, dispatching additional advisors and weaponry, and steadfastly supporting Diem. Yet, privately, even Kennedy harbored reservations. In 1961, Kennedy sanctioned the deployment of helicopters in Vietnam, allowing U.S. pilots to undertake support missions. Although not officially engaged in combat, they were drawing ever closer to the conflict. Some returned in body bags, while others never returned at all. Simultaneously, the Viet Cong continued to strengthen their position. Their attacks grew bolder, their recruitment efforts more successful, and they meticulously constructed underground tunnels. They trained in the dense jungle and disseminated their message, village by village. They were not merely fighting a government, they were offering a compelling alternative. And for many in the countryside, forgotten by Saigon and disregarded by generals, it was an enticing proposition. By 1962, the South Vietnamese government asserted control over most of the country. Yet in reality, the Viet Cong maintained a presence in over half of the villages. The South was slowly, quietly, and perilously hemorrhaging. Kennedy recognized the escalating deterioration but was not yet prepared to deploy combat troops. He hoped that with sufficient training and support, the South could defend itself. However, the stark truth was becoming undeniably clear. Diem's regime was too feeble, too corrupt, and too reviled to endure independently. In the north, Ho Chi Minh and his commanders had made their definitive choice. Reunification would not be achieved through negotiation or elections, but through insurgency, revolution, and outright war. Chapter 4. Advisors and Assassinations. By the early 1960s, the burgeoning conflict in Vietnam had transcended a mere Vietnamese dilemma. It had metastasized into a pervasive American problem. poised to swell in magnitude. Following the country's partition in 1954, the United States had channeled substantial financial aid and support into South Vietnam. Initially, this comprised economic assistance and political counsel, subsequently escalating to military equipment and comprehensive training missions. Yet, as the crisis deepened, maintaining a discreet presence became progressively more arduous. Under the leadership of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the U.S. held the conviction that the propagation of communism could be arrested without direct military engagement. His objective was to bolster the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, enabling them to independently confront the Viet Cong. American advisors arrived in escalating numbers, their mandate being to guide, instruct, and facilitate operational planning, not to engage in direct combat. However, the demarcation between support and combat grew increasingly tenuous. Eisenhower perceived Vietnam as an integral component of the broader Cold War geopolitical chessboard. Following China's Communist Revolution in 1949 and the Korean War's bisection of the peninsula, U.S. leadership harbored anxieties regarding a similar outcome in Southeast Asia. For them, South Vietnam represented a frontline state, its collapse potentially precipitating the fall of the entire region, the quintessential embodiment of the famous domino theory. Eisenhower's strategic imperative was to assist Diem in forging the Republic of Vietnam into a robust, anti-communist bulwark, a stable democracy armed and trained by the West. Yet, a fundamental flaw undermined this strategy. Diem was never genuinely democratic, and his governance grew more brutally oppressive with each passing day. Upon assuming office in 1961, John F. Kennedy inherited a chaotic landscape. The Viet Cong were steadily gaining ground, Diem's unpopularity was worsening, and American advisors were already succumbing to casualties. Kennedy faced a critical juncture: retreat or deepen involvement. He opted for the latter. Kennedy espoused the doctrine of counterinsurgency, positing that agile, smaller forces could effectively combat and vanquish guerrilla fighters. He significantly augmented the contingent of U.S. military advisors in Vietnam, from approximately 900 in 1960 to over 16,000 by 1963. Officially, these were not combat troops, yet they bore arms, conducted missions, and perished in ambushes. To many, they were undeniably already engaged in war. Kennedy also authorized the deployment of U.S. helicopters to support South Vietnamese troops, marking one of the initial instances where air mobility emerged as a pivotal instrument in guerrilla warfare. Soldiers could now be rapidly inserted deep into enemy territory within minutes, then extracted before the Viet Cong could regroup. Despite this substantial support, the war's trajectory remained unfavorable. The Viet Cong continued to expand their influence. In certain provinces, they held sway over the countryside by night, even if the government maintained control of the cities by day. They had established their own schools, their own judicial systems, and a clandestine administration in numerous rural enclaves. The predicament was not solely military, it was fundamentally political. Diem's government was fracturing from within. Diem, alongside his brother No Dinh Nhu, who served as chief political advisor and commanded the feared secret police, presided over a regime steeped in terror, arrests without due process, censorship, and torture chambers. They surveilled students, monks, and even military officers. Any suggestion of disloyalty met with severe retribution. However, what truly galvanized public opinion against Diem was his egregious treatment of Buddhists. Vietnam, a nation with a Buddhist majority, was governed by Diem's regime, which overtly favored Catholics. Catholics received preferential treatment in employment, land distribution, and promotions. In 1963, Diem issued a decree prohibiting the display of the Buddhist flag during religious festivals. Despite the continued allowance of Catholic symbols, this ignited a profound crisis. In May, Buddhist protesters converged in the city of Hue, where government troops opened fire, resulting in the deaths of 9 individuals, including children. Instead of issuing an apology, Diem callously blamed the protesters. Buddhists across the nation erupted in outrage. Monks engaged in silent marches, some initiated hunger strikes, and others commenced a new, profoundly heartbreaking form of protest. On June 11, 1963, in the very heart of Saigon, a monk named Viet Cong calmly seated himself on a busy thoroughfare, doused his body in gasoline, and set himself ablaze. He exhibited no flinching, no outcry. He sat serenely as the flames consumed him. Photographs of this harrowing moment stunned the world, leaving Americans aghast. Journalists, soldiers, and diplomats alike began to question the very bedrock of U.S. support in Vietnam. Kennedy was appalled as more monks followed suit with similar self-immolations. Diem's response was one of denial. His brother No Din Nu scoffed at the events, and his infamous wife, Madame Nu, derisively referred to the self-immolations as barbecues. The White House could no longer avert its gaze. Diem had become an undeniable liability. U.S. officials discreetly initiated discussions with South Vietnamese generals, conveying a subtle yet unmistakable message: if Diem were overthrown, America would not impede the action. In August 1963, Kennedy dispatched a cable authorizing U.S. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge to explore alternative leadership, thereby setting in motion the gears of a coup. Yet Kennedy hesitated, averse to direct involvement, and unwilling to have American hands stained with blood. Nevertheless, the generals pressed forward. On November 1, 1963, South Vietnamese troops surrounded the presidential palace. Diem and Nu attempted to flee through a secret tunnel, seeking to negotiate safe passage. They were apprehended the following day and, without trial or warning, executed at close range in the back of an armored vehicle, their bodies left bloodied and broken. News of their deaths reached Washington within hours. Kennedy was visibly shaken. While he had not ordered the killings, he acknowledged America's complicity. The CIA had conveyed messages. The ambassador had remained passive, and the advisors had averted their eyes. Kennedy reportedly stated, "We must bear a good deal of responsibility." Just 3 weeks later, Kennedy himself would be assassinated in Dallas. The world once again shifted on its axis. In Vietnam, chaos ensued. The generals who had overthrown Diem failed to agree on a successor, and one coup followed another. Military rule supplanted civilian governance, and then reversed, each new leader proving weaker than the last. Corruption spread like a virulent disease. America had harbored hopes that Diem's demise would stabilize South Vietnam. Instead, it exacerbated the situation. The Viet Cong celebrated, and the northern communists perceived an opportunity. Convinced that the South was crumbling and the opportune moment to strike was rapidly approaching, the U.S. was now ensnared in a self-made trap. It had removed a dictator but found no superior alternative. It had dispatched advisors but now required soldiers. It had yearned for a swift resolution but instead encountered a protracted disaster. Yet, no one in Washington desired to withdraw. To leave now would signify an admission of failure, a loss of face, and the unhindered spread of communism. Consequently, under the leadership of a new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, America's entanglement would deepen. The advisors would soon transform into combat troops, and the whispers of war were steadily crescendoing into a thunderous roar. Diem's assassination marked the conclusion of one chapter and the ominous commencement of another. Far more perilous one, a chapter defined by escalation, by relentless bombing campaigns, by burning jungles, and by skies teeming with helicopters. The Vietnam War was no longer merely brewing. It was on the precipice of a full-blown explosion. Chapter 5, Tonkin, Lies and War Cries. The year was 1964. Vietnam was already a smoldering cauldron of conflict. Yet it had not officially erupted into a full-scale American war. Following No Din Diem's assassination, South Vietnam plunged into political anarchy. Governments changed hands incessantly. with one military leader after another attempting to seize control, but none capable of restoring stability or stemming the relentless advance of the Viet Cong. Meanwhile, the United States watched with growing apprehension. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had assumed office after Kennedy's death, was not a decorated war hero or a seasoned Cold War strategist. He was a political titan, primarily focused on domestic reform, civil rights, and his ambitious, Great Society initiatives. However, Johnson could not disregard Vietnam. He had inherited Kennedy's war, and by 1964, the pivotal question was no longer whether America should intervene, but rather the extent of that involvement. The answer would emerge from the tumultuous waters of the South China Sea. It commenced with two U.S. Navy destroyers, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, conducting patrols in the Gulf of Tonkin, just off the coast of North Vietnam. Officially, these vessels were on routine patrol, but in reality, they were integral to Operation 34A, a clandestine mission involving South Vietnamese forces attacking North Vietnamese radar stations and coastal installations. The U.S. was not yet directly bombing the North, but it was actively gathering intelligence, probing, and exerting pressure. On August 2, 1964, the Maddox reported being approached by three North Vietnamese patrol boats. The U.S. ship fired warning shots, and the North Vietnamese retaliated. A brief naval engagement ensued. Torpedoes were launched, though none struck the Maddox, which returned fire, damaging at least one of the enemy boats. No Americans were killed. This was the initial incident, tense yet contained. Johnson was apprised of the situation and chose not to escalate. The Navy reinforced the area by dispatching the USS Turner Joy, and the ships resumed their patrol. Then came August 4th. On that particular night, amidst rough seas and under a stormy sky, radar operators aboard both the Maddox and Turner Joy believed they were once again under attack. They reported incoming torpedoes and enemy boats closing in. Alarms blared, and guns fired. The U.S. ships maneuvered wildly, attempting to evade what they perceived as an onslaught of attacks. For hours, chaos reigned on the decks. However, something was amiss. No enemy boats were visually confirmed, nor were any hits substantiated. Radar readings were ambiguous, possibly misinterpreted, as some sailors later attested to seeing nothing. Sonar pings may have been mere echoes, dolphins, or even wave disturbances. Nevertheless, the Navy reported an attack. In Washington, Johnson did not await definitive confirmation. That same night, he appeared on national television, his demeanor calm, serious, and presidential, asserting that repeated acts of violence against the armed forces of the United States must be met not only with alert defense but with positive reply. That reply is being given as I speak. American planes were already airborne, launching retaliatory strikes against North Vietnamese targets, including oil depots, patrol boat bases, and radar stations. Johnson framed these actions as necessary retaliation, a defensive measure to safeguard U.S. ships in international waters. He assured Congress that the U.S. sought not war, but merely peace and stability. Most Americans, at the time, believed him. Subsequently, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was swiftly drafted by Johnson's team. It bestowed upon the President the authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression in Southeast Asia. In essence, it was a blank check. Congress overwhelmingly passed the resolution, with only two senators, Wayne Morse and Ernest Gruening, voting against it. They perceived the veiled implications of the resolution, but their opposition was solitary. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution would ultimately become the legal bedrock for America's comprehensive military engagement in Vietnam. It was not an explicit declaration of war, but it granted Johnson the power to wage one without requiring further congressional approval. In public, Johnson maintained a cautious tone, telling the press he had no intention of sending American boys to fight a war that Vietnamese boys should be fighting for themselves. Yet, in private, his resolve was shifting. He had already dispatched additional advisors, and now the door was open for the deployment of combat troops, extensive bombing campaigns, and a massive escalation of the conflict. It was a pivotal turning point. Nevertheless, the truth underpinning the Gulf of Tonkin incident remained ambiguous. Within weeks, doubts began to surface. Intelligence officers raised concerns that the second alleged attack on August 4th, the catalyst for the retaliatory strikes, might not have occurred at all. Pentagon documents subsequently revealed that senior officials had deliberately misled the public, selectively highlighting evidence that supported their narrative. These doubts were meticulously suppressed, and the official narrative rigidly controlled. For years, Americans harbored the belief that North Vietnam had attacked U.S. ships without provocation. In reality, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces had been actively provoking the North for months. The Tonkin incident was not an outright fabrication, but it was far from the complete truth. It was a spark that ignited a monumental conflagration. By early 1965, Johnson had made his definitive decision: he would escalate the war. The Viet Cong were gaining ground. South Vietnam's army was struggling, and political instability threatened to internally dismantle the country. Johnson believed that only American power could salvage the situation. He ordered Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive and sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The objective was to cripple supply lines, erode morale, and compel Hanoi to negotiate. It failed. The bombs rained down for years, yet the North remained unyielding. Then, in March 1965, the first combat troops, Marines, landed at Da Nang, not as advisors or trainers, but as soldiers. America was now fully immersed in the war, and its origins could be traced back to that tempestuous night in the Gulf of Tonkin, a night characterized by confusion, faulty radar, and decisions made with undue haste. Johnson was unwilling to be perceived as weak, unwilling to lose Southeast Asia, unwilling to be the president held responsible for the loss of Vietnam, as others had been accused of losing China or Korea. Yet he also withheld the complete narrative. Once the bombs began to fall, there was no turning back. The war would persist for another decade, claiming over 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese lives. It would cleave a generation, shake the nation's fundamental beliefs, and ultimately conclude in a manner no one could have possibly foreseen at its inception. It all commenced in the waters of the Gulf, with a deception veiled in fear. The cries for war had begun. Advisors had transformed into soldiers, and the true Vietnam War had officially commenced. Chapter 6: Into the Quagmire. March 8, 1965. A date that irrevocably altered everything. It was early morning when the initial contingent of 3,500 U.S. Marines, the first American combat troops, disembarked onto the beaches of Da Nang in South Vietnam. Clad in helmets, flak jackets, and armed with rifles, their boots struck the sand not as welcomed guests or advisors, but as soldiers poised for battle. The Vietnam War had unequivocally entered a new, more profound phase. Prior to this, the U.S. role had largely remained behind the scenes, training, advising, planning. But now, the gloves were off, America was directly entering the fray. And it would prove to be neither a swift nor an easy conflict. From an external perspective, the plan appeared straightforward. Assist South Vietnam in vanquishing communist forces from the north, and the Viet Cong guerrillas in the south, secure battlefield victories, bolster the government, and contain the spread of communism. However, Vietnam was anything but simple. It was a world characterized by dense, humid, and utterly unfamiliar terrain, thick jungles, sprawling swamps, towering mountains, and villages that appeared idyllic by day only to transform into Viet Cong strongholds by night. The enemy did not adhere to conventional warfare. They wore no uniforms, drove no tanks, and marched in no discernible straight lines. They remained concealed within trees, an elaborate network of tunnels, and the ubiquitous rice paddies. They possessed an intimate knowledge of the terrain, moved with startling swiftness, and harbored one singular, unyielding objective: to relentlessly wear down the Americans until they ultimately capitulated and withdrew. U.S. commanders, clinging to the conviction that superior firepower would guarantee victory, deployed an overwhelming arsenal of helicopters, bombers, artillery, and armored vehicles. Enormous military bases were erected across South Vietnam, complete with airfields, intricate supply lines, and command centers. American soldiers were indoctrinated with the belief that they were fighting for freedom, that they were safeguarding democracy. Yet, once on the ground, many found themselves grappling with profound uncertainty regarding the identity of the enemy or the true meaning of their mission. The adversary could be anyone: a seemingly innocuous rice farmer, a teenager, or a woman carrying a simple basket. Moments later, a landmine would detonate, a shot would erupt from the jungle, or a patrol would vanish into the dense foliage, never to return. This was the war America entered, a conflict unlike any they had previously waged. U.S. strategy predominantly revolved around search and destroy missions. Helicopters would insert troops into remote areas, their directives clear: locate Viet Cong hideouts, annihilate supplies, eliminate fighters, and then withdraw. However, the Viet Cong rarely engaged in sustained, open combat. They struck with lightning speed, then evaporated. They meticulously set booby traps, sharpened bamboo spikes concealed within pits, trip wires connected to grenades, landmines buried along footpaths, and even children were exploited to carry explosives into markets and military camps. American soldiers grew increasingly frustrated. Distinguishing friend from foe became an agonizing impossibility. Villages that appeared tranquil one day could become lethal the next. And even when battles were won, there was no territory to seize, no enemy flag to capture, no discernible end in sight. The terrain itself constituted a silent, yet formidable, adversary. Vietnam's jungles were impenetrably thick and perpetually dark. The heat was stifling, almost unbearable. Leeches clung to skin, mosquitoes transmitted debilitating diseases, and rain often poured relentlessly for days on end, saturating clothes that never truly dried, causing feet to rot, and progressively eroding spirits. And always, perpetually, there was the agonizing waiting, the pervasive tension, the constant dread of ambush. Helicopters became the indispensable lifeline of the war. They transported troops, evacuated the wounded, and delivered vital supplies to locations inaccessible by road. Hueys, as they were affectionately called, were ubiquitous, their rotors buzzing ceaselessly above the treetops, hovering ominously in active fire zones, and kicking up clouds of dust as they landed in the rice fields. For countless soldiers, the rhythmic whirring of rotor blades became the melancholic soundtrack of their war. Yet, despite the overwhelming firepower, the Viet Cong continued their relentless advance. They utilized an extensive network of underground tunnels, some stretching for miles. In these dark, constricted spaces, they stored weaponry, resided, meticulously planned attacks, and vanished from sight. U.S. troops endeavored to dismantle these tunnels, but they were perpetually rebuilt. Some audacious soldiers, christened tunnel rats, voluntarily crawled into these subterranean labyrinths, often armed only with a flashlight and a pistol. It was an exceedingly perilous, claustrophobic, and terrifying undertaking. A single misstep could spell instant death. It was a war waged beneath the war. Above ground, clarity remained elusive. American commanders measured success predominantly by body count, the number of enemy soldiers killed. The higher the count, the closer they believed they were to achieving victory. However, this metric inadvertently exerted immense pressure on field commanders, fostering inflated reports. Civilians caught in the crossfire were sometimes fallaciously classified as enemy dead, thereby failing to reflect genuine progress. For even after major battles, the Viet Cong consistently reappeared. They fought with unwavering conviction for their homes, their land, their country. For them, it was not merely a war, but a struggle for survival. The U.S. also initiated programs to relocate rural villagers into strategic hamlets, fortified villages intended to shield civilians from Viet Cong influence. Yet, many villagers resented being uprooted. Their ancestral lands were confiscated, they were subjected to constant surveillance by soldiers, and frequently, the Viet Cong still managed to infiltrate these settlements under the cloak of night. Consequently, instead of winning hearts and minds, these programs sometimes inadvertently pushed the populace closer to the communists. Meanwhile, back in America, public support for the war, though still present, was beginning to wane. As more troops were dispatched, more names appeared in newspaper casualty lists, young men who had perished far from home in a land most Americans could not even pinpoint on a map. By the close of 1965, over 180,000 U.S. troops were deployed in Vietnam. By 1966, that figure had doubled, and by 1967, it had surpassed 500,000. More bombs were dropped on Vietnam than during all of World War II combined. Villages were razed, forests incinerated. A chemical agent known as Agent Orange was systematically sprayed across the landscape to destroy crops and expose enemy hiding places, leaving a poisonous legacy of birth defects, cancer, and ruined soil. The war had escalated to total warfare, yet there remained no discernible front line, no easily attainable victories, no clear end date. Some American troops began to question the very purpose of their mission. Why were they there? What were they protecting? Whom were they fighting for? Morale began to fracture. Drug use proliferated, discipline eroded, and racial tensions simmered. While many soldiers continued to fight with unwavering bravery and diligently performed their duties, others simply endeavored to survive their tour and return home alive. Meanwhile, in the White House, President Johnson confronted an agonizing dilemma. He was unwilling to concede defeat. Yet he possessed no clear strategy for victory. Annually, more troops were dispatched. Monthly, more bombs descended. Yet, the Viet Cong remained undefeated. The North Vietnamese government, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giap, remained steadfastly resolute and defiant. They believed that time was on their side, that all they needed to do was continue to bleed the Americans until public opinion irrevocably shifted, and that moment was slowly, inexorably, approaching. Nevertheless, in 1966 and 1967, Johnson clung to the belief that victory was attainable if only he deployed more troops, dropped more bombs, and maintained the course. But Vietnam was not a problem that could be resolved solely through overwhelming firepower. It was a quagmire, a treacherous landscape where every forward step seemed to ensnare America deeper. There was no apparent exit, no glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. Only more dense jungle, more insidious traps, more pervasive confusion. The war had now fully begun, and America found itself irrevocably entangled in its unforgiving embrace. Chapter 7, War of Shadows. They labeled it a war. Yet it bore scant resemblance to any conflict America had previously waged. There were no discernible front lines, no standardized uniforms, and no conventional rules of engagement. This was a war fought predominantly in the shadows, a realm where the enemy seamlessly vanished into the dense foliage of the trees, into the very earth itself, or effortlessly blended into the throng of civilians. It was a conflict where victory was not gauged by territorial gains but by sheer survival. The year was 1966. The U.S. now commanded a presence of over 180,000 troops in Vietnam, a number that was escalating rapidly. More helicopters, more supplies, more soldiers were pouring in. Yet no end to the conflict was in sight. This was because the adversary, the Viet Cong, adamantly refused to engage on America's terms. They harbored no desire for large-scale, conventional battles. They did not form ordered lines in the open, nor did they wear conspicuous colors or operate tanks. Instead, they moved through the jungle with an eerie silence, possessing an intimate understanding of the terrain and its inhabitants. They struck with devastating force, then vanished without a trace. For American troops, it was akin to battling phantoms. This was indeed the War of Shadows. The Viet Cong, or VC, were not solely fighters from the north. They were an eclectic mix of farmers, mechanics, school teachers, and South Vietnamese civilians who either genuinely embraced the communist ideology or had been coerced into providing assistance. They employed classic guerrilla tactics, surprise attacks, ambushes, sabotage, and the ubiquitous use of traps. They operated under the cloak of night, meticulously planting landmines during the day, then melting back into the jungle only to reappear miles away. For U.S. forces, it was an infuriating and disorienting reality. One might patrol a village, exchanging smiles with locals, even offering food and medical aid, only to return the following day and discover that the very same village had clandestinely hosted VC fighters overnight. Perhaps a tunnel had been meticulously dug directly beneath one's feet. Trust became a precious commodity. Anyone could be the enemy. This form of warfare exacted a profound psychological toll. One moment, a soldier would be traversing a tranquil rice paddy, the next, a mine would detonate, a friend would be gone, blood staining the water, yet no enemy in sight. It was not merely lethal, it was deeply personal, bewildering, and cruelly deceptive. The VC also extensively utilized booby traps, simple, inexpensive, yet horrifyingly effective devices. These included sharpened bamboo spikes, often coated in feces to induce infection, cunningly hidden beneath leaves. Trip wires were intricately connected to grenades, and rigged artillery shells were buried just beneath the surface. They had no need for tanks. Their arsenal consisted of patience and the grim certainty that Americans would eventually return home. But how did they move with such unhindered freedom? How did they strike from seemingly nowhere? The answer lay beneath the surface. The Viet Cong had constructed a vast and intricate network of tunnel systems, some extending for miles. These were not merely escape routes. They were subterranean cities, complete with meeting rooms, sleeping quarters, weapon storage facilities, kitchens, and even makeshift hospitals. Fighters could disappear underground and re-emerge days later in an entirely different location. In areas like Siu Chi, these tunnels formed a sprawling vascular system beneath the jungle. Some were barely wide enough to crawl through, while others were meticulously booby-trapped to eliminate intruders. They were oppressively hot, claustrophobic, and teeming with snakes, rats, and bats. To counter this subterranean threat, the U.S. formed tunnel rat teams, small soldiers who volunteered to venture into these dark confines armed only with a flashlight and a pistol. It was one of the most perilous assignments in the war. Every step could trigger a trap, and every turn might conceal an ambush. It was, in essence, a war being waged beneath the larger conflict. Above ground, the situation remained equally ambiguous. While some villages overtly supported the U.S. and the South Vietnamese government, many did not. Some harbored animosity towards both sides, while others were simply striving for survival. The U.S. attempted to garner support through various programs, including Hearts and Minds, initiatives aimed at building schools, roads, and hospitals. However, these efforts were frequently undermined by the very violence of the war itself. If a village was suspected of aiding the Viet Cong, it could be subjected to bombing, burning, or complete evacuation. Occasionally, entire villages were forcibly relocated to strategic hamlets, barbed wire compounds intended to segregate civilians from the enemy. This approach, however, often fostered resentment, as people were uprooted from their ancestral lands, their traditions, and their rice fields, feeling more like prisoners than protected citizens. And when U.S. troops swept through the countryside on search and destroy missions, conditions frequently deteriorated. Imagine being a young American, merely 19 or 20 years old, thrust into an incomprehensible environment, tasked with hunting an invisible enemy, and then witnessing your friends perish from traps, snipers, or landmines. Trust in the local populace eroded. and every farmer began to be perceived as a potential threat, every child a possible bomber. Fear transmuted into anger, and occasionally, that anger led to tragic consequences. Civilian casualties were an unfortunate reality, innocent lives caught in the relentless crossfire, homes annihilated, families shattered. For every genuine Viet Cong fighter killed, countless more innocents suffered. This blurred the ethical lines between good and evil, between us and them. That pervasive moral ambiguity and creeping doubt became an immense burden on every soldier's shoulders, for even when they emerged victorious from a firefight, what had they truly accomplished? The enemy would invariably return, the village would be rebuilt, and the war would remain unwinnable in the traditional sense. In some areas, entire forests were obliterated through the use of chemicals like Agent Orange, a defoliant sprayed from aircraft to eliminate jungle cover. However, it also poisoned the soil, caused cancer, and harmed both civilians and American soldiers. The U.S. deployed overwhelming power, airstrikes, artillery, helicopters, machine guns, but the VC countered with sheer endurance. They did not need to win every battle. They merely needed to outlast, to survive, to incessantly remind the Americans that they would never voluntarily depart Vietnam on their own terms. And they were omnipresent, in the tunnels, in the fields, in the villages, and sometimes even within the ranks of the South Vietnamese army. This was the ultimate nightmare. The enemy embedded among the Allies. The U.S. struggled to differentiate between a loyal soldier and a double agent. Some South Vietnamese officers covertly relayed intelligence to the North. Some units disintegrated in battle or fled under fire. Trust was a scarce commodity, and the accumulated stress began to take its toll. Soldiers started to break under the pressure. They questioned the war, they questioned their orders. Some resorted to drugs, others emotionally shut down, and racial tensions festered. Back home in America, families also began to pose difficult questions. Why were their sons dying? Why were they not winning? The government consistently asserted that the war was progressing favorably. But news from the front lines and images on television conveyed a starkly different narrative: bodies, villages engulfed in flames, helicopters lifting off with the wounded. This was not a clean war. It was a profound nightmare, and it showed no signs of improvement. The Viet Cong did not require sweeping victories. Their objective was straightforward: survive and exhaust. Their aim was to render the war so agonizingly painful, so morally ambiguous, and so politically unpopular that the U.S. would eventually withdraw. And piece by piece, they were succeeding. For in this war of shadows, every bullet, every bomb, every misstep became a potent tool in the struggle for hearts and minds, not merely in Vietnam, but back in the United States. The jungle was no longer the sole battlefield. The war was being waged in the minds of soldiers, within the hallowed halls of Congress, and in the living rooms of American families. While the U.S. possessed superior hardware, the Viet Cong commanded a profound understanding of history, an abundance of patience, and the formidable power of the unknown. They could be anyone, they could be anywhere, and that, more than anything else, rendered this war so utterly terrifying. It was not merely a contest of who possessed more weaponry. It was a test of who could endure longer in the pervasive darkness. Chapter 8: Operation Rolling Thunder. The jungle was impenetrable. The enemy remained elusive, and the ground war simply wasn't yielding results. So, in 1965, the United States turned its gaze skyward. Their objective was to shatter North Vietnam's will to fight, to dismantle its supply lines, to crush morale, and to compel Ho Chi Minh to surrender. They believed that bombs could achieve what bullets had not. Thus began Operation Rolling Thunder, one of the most intense and controversial bombing campaigns in history. It spanned from 1965 to 1968, though it was never intended to last so long. Initially, it appeared to be a demonstration of power, a stark warning, a signal to North Vietnam: cease supporting the Viet Cong or face dire consequences. However, the operation did not unfold as planned. The stated goal was to bomb key targets in North Vietnam, military bases, supply routes, bridges, and factories. Yet, the strategy was overly cautious. Constrained by the apprehension of President Lyndon B. Johnson and his advisors, who feared provoking China or the Soviet Union into direct involvement in the war. Consequently, every target required approval from Washington, sometimes even from LBJ himself. It was a slow, meticulously controlled campaign, but war does not wait. North Vietnam exploited this caution to meticulously prepare. They dispersed their supplies, concealed weaponry, and meticulously rebuilt roads and bridges overnight. And they received crucial assistance: Soviet radar systems, anti-aircraft guns, and surface-to-air missiles. U.S. bombers flew relentless sorties, but the enemy adapted. And the damage inflicted was not solely military. Entire villages were caught in the blast zones, civilians were injured, and schools, hospitals, and homes were destroyed, not always intentionally. But the outcome was invariably the same for the people on the ground. The sky became their adversary. Every roar of overhead jet engines brought with it an agonizing uncertainty. It wasn't just bombs, it was fire. The U.S. began deploying napalm, a jellied gasoline that adhered to skin and burned at excruciatingly high temperatures. It was not a precision weapon, it spread, consumed, and killed indiscriminately. Napalm bombs were dropped to clear forests and attack enemy hideouts, but they frequently landed on villages, leaving behind charred bodies, scorched earth, and an indelible horror. A poignant photograph of a young Vietnamese girl running naked down a road, her skin burning from napalm, shocked the world. Her name was Van T. Kim Phuc, and her image became a searing symbol of the war's brutality. Then came Agent Orange. This chemical defoliant was designed to strip the jungle bare, exposing the enemy and annihilating crops that sustained the Viet Cong plains, sprayed it across thousands of square miles, killing plants, poisoning the soil, and leaving behind a grim legacy of suffering. Agent Orange contained dioxin, a highly toxic compound unequivocally linked to cancer, birth defects, and other severe health problems. Its devastating effects were not limited to the Vietnamese. American soldiers who handled the chemical began falling ill, and decades later, their children were born with abnormalities. The profound cost of this chemical warfare would continue to be paid long after the last bomb fell. Back in Washington, Operation Rolling Thunder was devolving into a political quagmire. The military advocated for greater autonomy to target crucial locations like ports and airfields in the North, but the White House staunchly refused, fearful of further escalation. Consequently, they severely restricted the campaign, thereby limiting its effectiveness. Pilots experienced profound frustration. They risked their lives flying into heavily defended areas, only to be denied permission to strike the most strategically important targets. Meanwhile, North Vietnam was forging an unwavering reputation. Despite the relentless bombing, they refused to surrender, showing no signs of slowing down. In fact, their resolve hardened. They ingeniously exploited the air war for propaganda purposes, transforming every bomb that struck a village into another justification for fighting, every child injured by napalm into more fuel for anti-American sentiment. The Viet Cong in the south only grew stronger, and supplies continued to flow relentlessly down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex labyrinth of paths, tunnels, and roads winding through Laos and Cambodia. The U.S. heavily bombed the trail, but the Vietnamese rebuilt it with astounding speed, often faster than it could be destroyed. They moved predominantly at night, utilizing bicycles reinforced with wood, and dug elaborate storage bunkers into mountainsides. They ingeniously transformed nature itself into their most potent weapon. The more the U.S. bombed, the more resolute they became. By late 1967, after nearly 3 years of sustained bombing, the results were unequivocally clear. Operation Rolling Thunder had dropped more bombs on Vietnam than all the bombs dropped during World War II combined. Yet, its strategic impact was negligible. The North had not collapsed, and the war remained unresolved. Furthermore, support for the war at home in America was rapidly eroding. Television brought the unvarnished reality of the war directly into people's living rooms. Viewers witnessed burned villages, terrified children, and wounded soldiers, prompting them to question. Why? Why was America unleashing such a torrent of bombs on such a diminutive country? Why were innocent people dying? Why wasn't it working? Even within the U.S. government, officials began to express doubts about the campaign. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, once a staunch proponent of the air war, underwent a profound change of heart. He recognized the strategy's futility and witnessed its immense human cost, leading him to question everything. He would later famously state, "We were wrong, terribly wrong." By 1968, Operation Rolling Thunder was gradually winding down. It had cost billions of dollars, over 900 American aircraft had been lost, and hundreds of pilots had been killed or captured. Yet victory remained elusive. In March of that year, following the shocking impact of the Tet Offensive, President Johnson made a momentous announcement. He would halt most of the bombing of North Vietnam and would not seek re-election. It was a pivotal turning point. Operation Rolling Thunder, which had commenced as a symbol of American strength, concluded as a stark emblem of confusion, frustration, and the inherent limits of power. It demonstrated that technology and overwhelming firepower alone could not resolve every problem. That sometimes the harder one strikes, the more one alienates. It unveiled a deeper truth. This was not merely a military conflict, it was a political war, a psychological war. A war for hearts and minds, and bombing from above could never win it. The jungles remained dense, the enemy remained hidden, and the war was far from over. The next phase of the conflict would shift back to the ground, to the cities, to the villages, to the people themselves, and what transpired next would profoundly shake the entire world. Chapter 9. Westmoreland's War. The bombs had fallen, the skies had thundered, yet victory remained elusive. As Operation Rolling Thunder lost its momentum, the focus of the conflict inevitably shifted back to the ground. Leading this ground war was one man, General William Westmoreland. Tall, self-assured, and perpetually clad in uniform, Westmoreland became the quintessential embodiment of America's involvement in Vietnam. He held a firm conviction that the U.S. could achieve triumph, not by seizing territory or winning over the populace, but by annihilating as many of the enemy as possible. For him, success was not measured by acreage but by body counts. His reasoning, at least on paper, was straightforward. The U.S. possessed superior manpower, overwhelming firepower, and immense financial resources. Therefore, if they could eliminate a sufficient number of North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong fighters, the enemy would eventually deplete its personnel and be compelled to surrender. This strategy became known as the War of Attrition, a relentless grinding down of the enemy, one casualty at a time. Westmoreland's preferred tactic for this was search and destroy. Missions. U.S. troops would be transported, either by air or ground, into hostile territory. They would then sweep through villages, jungles, and rice paddies, relentlessly searching for enemy forces. Upon encountering them, they would summon artillery, helicopters, or air strikes to decimate them, and then withdraw. There was no attempt to hold captured ground or establish a lasting presence in those villages, simply kill and move on. To the generals in Washington, this approach made logical sense. But on the ground, it was pure chaos. The enemy did not adhere to conventional rules of engagement. They wore no uniforms, did not gather in large formations, and employed ambushes, booby traps, and an extensive network of tunnels. Sometimes, a deceptively tranquil-looking village would suddenly erupt in gunfire. Other times, soldiers would venture into the jungle and never return. And when they did encounter resistance, it was not always from the enemy. Villages frequently found themselves caught in the crossfire. Entire communities were incinerated under the suspicion of aiding the Viet Cong. Sometimes these suspicions were accurate, Sometimes they were not, but the U.S. strategy left little room for nuanced inquiry. Soldiers were instructed to engage aggressively, depart swiftly, and meticulously tally the casualties. This body count became the sole metric of success, not victories, not territorial gains, not the prospect of peace, but simply the number of enemy troops killed. After each mission, commanders would report the number of Viet Cong or North Vietnamese soldiers killed. The higher the number, the more successful the mission was deemed. However, a critical flaw permeated this system. No one truly knew how many of the dead were actually enemy fighters. Villagers, women, and even children were sometimes included in these counts. Some reports were exaggerated, others simply erroneous. Slowly, a grim truth began to spread among the troops. If you couldn't locate enough Viet Cong, you simply manipulated the numbers to appear more favorable. This was not official policy, but it occurred, and back home, those inflated figures perpetuated the illusion of progress. General Westmoreland confidently assured Congress and the American populace that the U.S. was on the verge of victory, that the enemy was being worn down, that the light at the end of the tunnel was visible. Yet, for the soldiers on the ground, it felt nothing like victory. It was a perpetual cycle of mud, fear, exhaustion, and pervasive confusion. They would clear a village, eliminate a few fighters, perhaps lose one or two of their own, and then move on, only to find the enemy re-established in the same village a few days later. It was like battling a phantom that relentlessly reappeared. Westmoreland continuously requested more troops. By 1967, over 400,000 U.S. soldiers were deployed in Vietnam. By 1968, that number would swell to over 500,000. However, a larger troop presence did not equate to greater success. Many new recruits were draftees, fresh out of high school, thrust into a jungle war they could not comprehend, in a country they had never even heard of. Morale began to plummet. Drug use, alcohol abuse, and even insubordination became increasingly common. Some soldiers began to question the mission's validity, while others simply yearned to survive their tour of duty and return home. For the Vietnamese people, this strategy proved devastating. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were frequently incinerated, entire families displaced, rice fields destroyed, and water buffaloes shot. The enemy capitalized on this destruction. The Viet Cong utilized the damage inflicted by U.S. forces as irrefutable proof that America was not liberating Vietnam, but rather systematically destroying it. The North Vietnamese disseminated messages via radio, printed leaflets, and exploited every civilian casualty to fuel their cause. And it worked. Even some South Vietnamese citizens began to covertly support the opposing side. Meanwhile, in America, the war became increasingly difficult to defend. Journalists embedded with soldiers witnessed the destruction firsthand. They reported on the horrors of napalm, the images of dead children, and burning homes. They challenged the validity of the body counts and questioned, "What are we actually achieving here?" And when the official numbers failed to align with the grim reality, public trust began to erode. Still, Westmoreland stubbornly insisted that the war was progressing favorably, that the enemy was being worn down, and that with just a little more time and a few more troops, ultimate victory would be achieved. But this was a falsehood. The North Vietnamese were not capitulating, and the Viet Cong were not running out of fighters. While America remained fixated on body counts, the enemy was meticulously planning something far more audacious, a surprise, a shock that would fundamentally alter everything. But before we delve into that, it is imperative to understand why Westmoreland clung to this strategy for so long. He was a conventional soldier, a veteran of World War II, who firmly believed in the power of numbers, charts, and mathematical equations. He reasoned that if you killed more enemies than they killed of you, you were winning. However, Vietnam defied such simplistic logic. The enemy was not preoccupied with body counts, they were counting time. They firmly believed that if they could endure long enough, The American public would eventually turn against the war, and that is precisely what began to transpire. Protests back home grew louder, parents yearned for the return of their sons. Students marched in the streets, and people, watching the nightly news, perceived no end in sight. And when soldiers returned home, they were not greeted with parades but with silence, or worse, judgment. Westmoreland still envisioned victory, but the war was inexorably slipping through his grasp. The enemy held one final card to play, a massive, coordinated attack that would shatter the illusion of American control. That pivotal moment would arrive in the subsequent chapter. But for now, as 1967 drew to a close, Westmoreland, with serene confidence, addressed the cameras and reporters, declaring that the war was nearly won. He was mistaken. The impending attack would prove it, and the entire world would witness its unfolding in real time. Chapter 10. The World Watches. As the verdant jungles of Vietnam burned and American soldiers marched through the ubiquitous rice paddies, the world was not merely observing, it was actively reacting. From the frigid expanse of Moscow to the bustling streets of Beijing, from the romantic boulevards of Paris to the ancient cities of New Delhi, from the historic heart of London to the modern metropolis of Tokyo, the distant Vietnam War had transcended a localized conflict. It had metastasized into a global crisis, serving as a symbol, a stark warning, and an open wound. Its drama unfolded live, on newspaper pages, across television screens, and in the resonating echoes of protests that reverberated through city streets worldwide. The Cold War had already cleaved the world into ideological camps. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a tense, protracted standoff, each superpower relentlessly striving to accrue influence in every corner of the globe. For Washington, Vietnam was fundamentally about thwarting the spread of communism. For Moscow and Beijing, however, Vietnam represented something entirely different, an unparalleled opportunity to strategically drain American power. Let us begin with the Soviet Union. From the nascent stages of the conflict, the USSR perceived North Vietnam as an invaluable ally in Southeast Asia, a communist regime valiantly resisting Western imperialism. This was precisely the kind of struggle the Soviets eagerly sought to support. Consequently, they dispatched thousands of rifles, machine guns, and rockets. They provided sophisticated anti-aircraft systems to shoot down American planes, supplied MiG fighter jets, advanced radar systems, and even meticulously trained North Vietnamese pilots and technicians. Yet their assistance extended far beyond mere hardware. Soviet advisors aided in the construction of intricate underground bunkers, instructed North Vietnamese forces on how to effectively jam American communications, and even supplied essential fuel trucks and spare parts. All of this was conducted with utmost discretion, behind closed doors. The Soviet Union harbored no desire for a direct military confrontation with America, but they were more than content to covertly finance a war against America. In total, the Soviets funneled billions of dollars worth of aid to North Vietnam. However, they were not the sole patrons. China also entered the fray. Initially, relations between China and North Vietnam were exceptionally close. Both were communist nations, both had valiantly struggled against colonial powers, and both viewed the United States as a shared adversary. Chairman Mao Zedong firmly believed that assisting North Vietnam was a strategic imperative, a means to directly challenge American influence near China's borders. Consequently, China deployed hundreds of thousands of support troops, not for direct combat, but for vital logistical functions. They constructed roads and railways, erected anti-air defenses, meticulously repaired bridges, and ensured the unimpeded flow of supply lines. They provided food, ammunition, and medical supplies to North Vietnam. Chinese support proved absolutely crucial in the early years of the conflict. Yet, underlying tensions also existed. As the 1960s progressed, China and the Soviet Union began to engage in an increasingly acrimonious ideological dispute over which nation genuinely held the mantle of leadership in the communist world. This schism, famously known as the Sino-Soviet split, profoundly impacted North Vietnam. While both powers continued to support the war, they began to compete fiercely for influence in Hanoi. North Vietnam, in turn, skillfully played both sides, accepting aid from both Moscow and Beijing while steadfastly refusing to fully align with either. It was a delicate, high-stakes geopolitical dance, and it proved effective. Thanks to the combined support of the Soviet Union and China, North Vietnam possessed sufficient firepower, training, and supplies to sustain its protracted struggle year after year. But while governments dispatched aid, the global populace, particularly in the West, began to lose its patience. In European nations such as France, West Germany, and the United Kingdom, many perceived the Vietnam War not as a noble endeavor but as a direct continuation of colonialism. France, especially, carried its own indelible scars, having colonized Vietnam for nearly a century, and having suffered a resounding defeat at Dien Bien Phu. Observing America's attempt to fix Vietnam felt eerily like déjà vu, and not in a positive way. In Paris, protests erupted, with students filling the streets, chanting anti-war slogans. Intellectuals published scathing books and articles denouncing U.S. actions. Some even traveled to North Vietnam in solidarity. One of the most renowned figures, Jean-Paul Sartre, famously condemned the war as a crime and accused the U.S. of perpetrating suffering under the pretext of promoting freedom. In West Germany, students who had matured in the shadow of Nazi guilt now openly questioned American power and military aggression. Demonstrations swelled, police clashed with protesters, and a new generation awoke, unequivocally rejecting blind allegiance to any superpower. Even in Canada, a nation traditionally closely allied with the U.S., widespread opposition to the war emerged. While Canada officially maintained neutrality, Canadian hospitals provided medical care to wounded American soldiers. Simultaneously, thousands of young American men crossed the border into Canada to evade the draft. And then there was Japan, still recovering from the devastation of World War II. Japan had painstakingly rebuilt itself into a staunch U.S. ally. However, the Vietnam War deeply troubled many Japanese citizens, who feared their country being drawn into yet another conflict. Anti-war marches grew in size, particularly among students and workers. Meanwhile, in India, a newly independent nation grappling with its own internal struggles, many leaders and intellectuals condemned the war, viewing it as a fundamental clash between imperialism and the inherent right to self-determination. Even in Africa and Latin America, where nations were fiercely battling for their own freedom and identity, people closely monitored the Vietnam War. Many regarded the Vietnamese as heroic, small yet defiant, standing resolute against a formidable giant. But perhaps the most significant global reaction emanated from within the United States itself. As harrowing footage of the war permeated nightly news broadcasts, burning villages, wounded soldiers, crying children, Americans began to question everything. College campuses became hotbeds of protest, draft cards were publicly incinerated, anti-war songs were penned, and flags were both proudly waved and defiantly burned. Some Americans firmly believed the war was a necessary evil, that communism absolutely had to be halted. However, an increasing number held a different conviction, that the U.S. had no legitimate business in Vietnam, that far too many lives were being tragically lost for a conflict that no one truly comprehended. The global anti-war movement gained immense traction. In London, Rome, Amsterdam, and Copenhagen, throngs of people marched through the streets, vociferously demanding an end to the violence. In Stockholm, students occupied U.S. embassies. In Australia, a crucial U.S. ally, opposition grew increasingly vocal as families began to question why their sons were being dispatched to die in a war so geographically distant. Across the globe, the Vietnam War had transcended a mere localized conflict in Southeast Asia. It had become an overarching symbol of resistance, injustice, and a profound loss of faith in the established powers. But what tangible impact did this global outpouring have on the war itself? On one level, very little. The bombs continued to fall, the soldiers continued to fight, and the body count inexorably continued to rise. However, on a deeper, more fundamental level, it signified everything. The United States was not merely waging a war in Vietnam. It was simultaneously fighting a war of perception across the globe, and it was demonstrably losing that battle. When one's allies question one's purpose, when one's own populace marches in opposition to one's choices, and when one's enemy is actively supported by two global powers, achieving victory becomes exponentially more arduous. For the North Vietnamese, this global reaction was an invaluable boon. They skillfully incorporated it into their propaganda, showcasing images of worldwide protests to their soldiers, telling them, "Look, the world is on our side." And frequently, they were right. As the war inexorably dragged on, America found itself increasingly isolated. With fewer allies and a torrent of escalating criticism, yet no easy path to extrication. The world was observing, and what it witnessed was not strength, but confusion, violence, and profound uncertainty. Soon, that uncertainty would culminate in the most profoundly shocking moment of the entire war, a moment that would shake America to its very core. But for now, as the war transitioned into its next phase, one truth was undeniable. The war in Vietnam was no longer merely about Vietnam. It was about the world, and the world was watching. Chapter 11. Life and Death in the Jungle. The world, indeed, watched, but in the dense, suffocating heart of the jungle, there were no cameras, no echoing protests, no impassioned speeches. There was only the oppressive heat, the pervasive silence, the sound of one's own labored breath, and the agonizing question every soldier silently posed, every single day. Am I going to die today? This was the war from its grim interior, the raw, brutal, day-to-day existence of the men dispatched to fight it, not generals, not presidents, but merely boys, young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, hailing from the bustling streets of Chicago, the quiet farms of Georgia, the sweeping plains of Iowa, the vibrant neighborhoods of Harlem. They were thrust into a world they utterly failed to comprehend. Some voluntarily enlisted, but the vast majority did not. Some genuinely believed in the mission, but many had no clear understanding of what that mission truly entailed. What they knew, unequivocally, was this: they were in Vietnam, and it was an inferno. It bore no resemblance to any conflict America had previously engaged in. There were no discernible front lines, no coherent battle maps, just an impenetrable, thick jungle, clinging mud, incessant insects, and a heat so oppressive it could melt one's will to fight. And the enemy? They were unseen, like ghosts. They could be unassuming farmers by day and lethal ambushers by night. They possessed an intimate knowledge of every trail, every tree, every tunnel. One could inadvertently stumble into a trap without the slightest inkling until the jungle violently erupted around them. Many U.S. soldiers arrived harboring expectations of heroic endeavors. Instead, they encountered a surreal and terrifying reality. They did not march triumphantly into towns, waving flags. They were helicoptered into landing zones, their hearts pounding with trepidation, utterly uncertain of what awaited them below. Sometimes, the landing zone was eerily silent. Other times, it was a hot zone, with bullets raining down like a relentless storm before their boots even touched the ground. They would leap into towering elephant grass, bullets snapping overhead, friends screaming for medics. They would return fire at elusive shadows, never knowing if their shots found their mark, only continuing to fire, continuing to move. Many days were consumed by patrolling, long, arduous, seemingly endless treks in the oppressive heat, burdened by 60-pound packs, perpetually wet socks, and an omnipresent threat of traps. The Viet Cong employed 1,000 methods to inflict casualties without ever revealing their faces: punji traps, sharpened bamboo sticks, often coated in excrement to induce infection, cunningly hidden beneath leaves. Step in the wrong place, and one was not merely wounded, but infected. Booby traps included grenades wired to trees, tripped wires stretched across jungle trails, and even explosives meticulously concealed within soda cans. The jungle was not merely a battlefield, it was a living entity, and it yearned to kill. And it wasn't solely the enemy one fought. It was the jungle itself: snakes, mosquitoes, leeches, malaria, dengue fever, and debilitating skin infections that transformed feet into raw meat. Sleep was a luxury. Clean clothes and showers mere fantasies. It rained relentlessly, sometimes for weeks, leaving soldiers perpetually soaked by day and shivering with cold by night. One would embark on patrol, caked in mud, return to base, perhaps consume some cold rations, then sleep on the floor with rats scurrying over one's pack. But the most excruciating aspect was the waiting. One could walk for hours and discover nothing, sit in agonizing silence for days, and then, boom, an ambush. Screams, smoke, gunfire, and in less than a minute it was over. One soldier who survived recounted years later. The worst wasn't the firefight. It was what came next. The quiet. You didn't know who was dead or where the next bullet might come from. You didn't just fear death, you feared not knowing. Every bush became a potential threat, every shadow a harbinger of death. Soldiers slept with their rifles, kept the safety off, and never removed their boots, for if they had to run in the night, they would surely die barefoot. And yet, miraculously, amidst all that terror, something else began to flourish. An unbreakable brotherhood. It seems paradoxical that in an environment designed to utterly crush the human spirit, soldiers discovered something indestructible: not patriotism, not political alignment, not ideological conviction, but each other. They did not fight for their country, they fought for the man beside them, the one who offered a cigarette after a grueling patrol, the one who shielded them with his own body when a mortar round struck, the one who shared his last drops of water when their own supply ran dry. And when he died, when his body was zipped into a bag and airlifted out, it tore an unfillable void within them that would never truly close. There were moments, fleeting interludes amidst the pervasive chaos, that etched themselves permanently into their memories. A patrol through a quiet jungle when birds, after the cacophony of gunfire, tentatively returned to their song. A game of cards in a hooch constructed of sandbags, or a letter from home, redolent with the scent of perfume. Some wrote back, some did not, and some never made it back at all. But the war did not merely wound the body, it profoundly scarred the mind. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was not even a recognized term at that time, but its debilitating symptoms were ubiquitous. Soldiers suffered from insomnia, flinched at loud noises, could not erase the smell of burning from their senses, and were haunted by the cries of wounded friends. Many returned home physically intact but emotionally shattered. They desperately attempted to reintegrate into American life. But how does one explain to someone what it is like to carry a friend's lifeless body to a helicopter? To kill someone who appeared to be a mere farmer only to discover a grenade concealed beneath their shirt? How does one articulate the fear of silence, knowing that is precisely when ambushes invariably occurred? The pain did not cease when the tour of duty ended. For countless Vietnam veterans, it never truly abated. Drug abuse, alcoholism, violence, and depression became an inescapable part of daily life for innumerable veterans. For far too long, America was unwilling to hear their stories, unwilling to confront their scars, unwilling to admit that this war had broken its own soldiers. Yet, within every man who served resided a unique narrative. Some shared theirs, some buried it, and some carried it with them to their graves. One soldier, years later, poignantly wrote, "We weren't heroes. We weren't villains. We were just kids sent to do a job no one understood, in a war no one wanted to win." And maybe that's the deepest wound of all. Because in warfare, trauma is an ever-present reality, but in Vietnam, there was an additional layer of pervasive confusion. No clear objective, no definitive end. And yet those men, those boys, continued to perform their duties, not out of desire, but out of necessity. They endured the jungle's unforgiving embrace, the insidious traps, the paralyzing fear, the omnipresent specter of death. They survived when others did not. And though they were never greeted with the triumphal parades afforded to the soldiers of World War II, though many suffered in silence upon their return, their stories hold immense significance. For the narrative of Vietnam transcends mere politicians or abstract maps. It is fundamentally about the human beings who traversed hell with mud-caked boots and rifles in their hands. It is about the profound pain they carried, the unbreakable friendships they forged, the innocence they irrevocably lost, and the uncomfortable truths they left in their wake. Chapter 12. The Tet Offensive. It is often said that some battles are not solely waged with bullets. Some are fought with perception, with the power of shock, with impeccable timing, and with the capacity to fundamentally alter how people perceive a conflict. The Tet Offensive unequivocally embodied such a battle. It did not secure territorial gains, nor did it decisively crush the U.S. military. Instead, it shattered something far more profound, the pervasive illusion that America was on the verge of victory. It commenced in early 1968. The war had already been a protracted and agonizing affair for years. U.S. troop numbers had surged past 500,000, and General Westmoreland exuded confidence. He assured the press, the President, and the American populace that triumph was imminent, that the enemy was weakening, that the war was nearing its conclusion. However, in Hanoi, the North Vietnamese leadership harbored a vastly different perspective. They were meticulously orchestrating something audacious, perilous, and of immense scale. They referred to it as a general offensive and uprising. The plan was to unleash the full force of their military might across South Vietnam, everywhere, simultaneously. Their hope was that the South Vietnamese populace would rise up and join them, that the Americans would be caught entirely off guard, and that, just perhaps, they could bring the war to an abrupt end with one shocking blow. But the true brilliance of the Tet Offensive lay in its timing. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, the most significant holiday in Vietnam, a time traditionally dedicated to family, rest, and cherished traditions. Normally, both sides in the conflict observed an informal ceasefire during Tet. This time, however, North Vietnam brazenly violated those unspoken rules. In the pre-dawn hours of January 30th, 1968, just as Tet celebrations were commencing, the attacks began. It was not confined to a single city, nor was it merely a surprise raid. It was ubiquitous. More than 100 cities, military bases, and outposts across South Vietnam were simultaneously struck in a coordinated assault that the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces never anticipated. In Saigon, the capital, explosions reverberated through the city, and gunfire echoed in the streets. Even the U.S. Embassy, the most heavily fortified edifice in the city, came under attack. A small team of Viet Cong commandos breached the wall and stormed the compound. Although they were eventually neutralized, the image was indelibly burned into the public consciousness. If the U.S. Embassy could be penetrated, was any place truly secure? Elsewhere, in Hue, a historic city near the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the war ignited. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army seized control of substantial portions of the city. For nearly a month, U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese troops engaged in fierce house-to-house, block-by-block combat. When the battle finally concluded, Hue lay devastated, with thousands of civilians dead. And as the fog of war lifted, an even darker horror emerged: mass graves. Over 800 South Vietnamese civilians had been executed by communist forces during the occupation: city officials, teachers, doctors, even monks. It stood as one of the war's most heinous atrocities. In military terms, the Tet Offensive proved to be a catastrophic failure for North Vietnam. They failed to hold the cities, they did not incite a mass uprising among the populace. and they suffered tens of thousands of casualties, many of whom were irreplaceable veteran fighters. However, these military shortcomings were inconsequential. Because the true victory was not attained on the battlefield, it was secured in the living rooms of America. The attacks were broadcast live on television screens across the United States. Families watching the nightly news witnessed chaos in Saigon, smoke billowing from embassies, soldiers being dragged from buildings, and civilians fleeing in sheer panic. And they posed a fundamental question to themselves. I thought we were winning, even though U.S. forces successfully repelled the attackers. And despite the crippling losses inflicted upon the Viet Cong, public opinion irrevocably shifted. Americans no longer believed the reassurances they were being fed. If the enemy could launch an attack of this magnitude after all these years, after all those promises of victory, then perhaps this war could not be won. One of America's most respected news anchors, Walter Cronkite, traveled to Vietnam immediately after Tet. He witnessed the devastation firsthand. Upon his return, he famously declared on air, "It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge." That statement resonated profoundly. President Lyndon B. Johnson, reportedly watching from the White House, uttered, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." And in many respects he had. Support for the war plummeted, protests surged, and the credibility of the government was shattered. LBJ's approval ratings nosedived, and just weeks after Tet, in a stunning announcement, he informed the nation he would not seek re-election. The Tet Offensive effectively broke his presidency. It also fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of the war. General Westmoreland, who had been requesting an additional 200,000 troops, was replaced. A new approach emerged, less focused on outright military victory and more on finding a viable exit strategy. This marked the genesis of Vietnamization, a policy aimed at gradually transferring responsibility for the fighting to South Vietnamese forces while progressively withdrawing U.S. troops. However, for the time being, the war continued its relentless rage. And the irony was stark. While the Viet Cong were nearly annihilated in the Tet Offensive, their spirit became stronger than ever. For the people they sought to influence were not solely in Vietnam, they were in America. And with just one daring offensive, they planted a seed of doubt that would steadily proliferate until it could no longer be ignored. Tet was not merely a turning point, it was a psychological earthquake. It did not conclude the war, but it irrevocably transformed it. It compelled Americans to confront questions they had previously avoided. Why are we truly here? What are we fighting for? And at what ultimate cost? The men in the jungle continued to fight, continued to die, but something fundamental had shifted. And once the collective consciousness of a nation began to change, the rest would inevitably follow. Chapter 13: The War at Home. As the jungles of Vietnam burned with an infernal intensity, so too did the streets of America. The war, once peddled as a noble crusade against the tide of communism, had returned home, not with the deafening roar of guns or the searing agony of napalm, but with the fervent cries of picket signs, the rhythmic cadence of chants, the stinging bite of tear gas, and a profound, seething fury. The Tet Offensive had irrevocably shaken America's entrenched belief in the inevitability of victory, yet what followed was something far more profound than mere doubt. It was an eruption of unadulterated rage. Anger directed at the government, anger at the insidious tapestry of lies. Anger at a system that seemed to blithely sacrifice young men by the thousands for a cause in which fewer and fewer people still believed. This was not a conflict confined to the distant jungles of Southeast Asia. It was now a war being waged relentlessly on college campuses, within the hallowed halls of courtrooms, in the intimate confines of kitchens, and starkly displayed on the evening news. And it ripped the very fabric of the nation in two. At the epicenter of this tumultuous maelstrom was the draft, a system that forcibly conscripted young American men into military service, irrespective of their personal inclination. Initially, The draft was perceived as an unavoidable component of wartime. However, by the late 1960s, a profound shift had occurred. Many began to question the inherent fairness of a system that disproportionately dispatched working-class boys to their deaths while the affluent and influential adeptly discovered avenues to circumvent service. Why were Black Americans expected to valiantly fight for freedom abroad when the promise of full freedom remained elusive within their own homeland? Why were individuals compelled to fight in a war they fundamentally opposed? Protesters were no longer merely voicing dissent, they were actively resisting. They publicly burned their draft cards, chained themselves to recruiting stations, and occupied university halls, shouting directly into the faces of generals. And when law enforcement arrived, they did not flee, they resisted. Sometimes with symbolic flowers, sometimes with clenched fists. By 1968, the anti-war movement had exploded in unprecedented fashion. College campuses transformed into veritable battlegrounds. Students at institutions like Berkeley, Columbia, and Kent State were not simply skipping classes, they were seizing control of buildings, vociferously demanding that their schools sever ties with the military, and insisting that their voices be heard in Washington, D.C. Hundreds of thousands of Americans converged on the nation's capital, carrying placards emblazoned with slogans like, "Hell no, we won't go," and "Bring the boys home." They inundated the National Mall with thunderous chants of, "Stop the war." Sometimes they sang, sometimes they clashed violently with police, but always, they generated an undeniable clamor. And it was not solely students participating. Veterans, men who had personally experienced the horrors of the jungles and witnessed the war's brutality firsthand, began to speak out. In 1971, a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War organized a powerful protest in Washington, D.C. known as Dewey Canyon 3. One by one, they stood before the Capitol building and defiantly hurled their medals, the very medals for which they had bled, onto the steps. Some shouted, some wept, declaring their refusal to be exploited any longer. This war, they proclaimed, was no longer about honor, it was about insidious lies. While the war raged relentlessly overseas, America found itself grappling with another raging fire, the civil rights movement. The Vietnam War and the fight for civil rights were not disparate struggles. They were inextricably intertwined. Black leaders, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., began to speak out not only against racism but also against the war itself. In 1967, King delivered a profoundly impactful speech titled, "Beyond Vietnam," in which he characterized the U.S. government as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He posed a searing question. How can we send poor black boys to fight and die in Southeast Asia while they still live in poverty and injustice here at home? That speech cost him some supporters. Many turned against him, and the White House distanced itself, but King remained unyielding. Soon, others joined his courageous stance. Muhammad Ali, the world heavyweight boxing champion, garnered headlines when he famously refused to be drafted, declaring, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." For this defiant stance, he was stripped of his title, banned from boxing, and faced imprisonment. Yet he transmuted into a powerful symbol of courage, resistance, and unwavering commitment to standing against a war one did not believe in. And yet, not everyone opposed the war. America was profoundly fractured. For every protester there was someone proudly waving the flag, someone who firmly believed in the righteousness of the war. Someone who deemed the protesters unpatriotic, or worse, traitors. They derisively labeled them hippies, draft dodgers, and more. This was not merely a political schism, it was generational, cultural, and deeply emotional. Fathers engaged in bitter arguments with sons, friendships dissolved, neighborhoods divided, and some families never fully recovered. In 1969, a terrifying event unfolded. Richard Nixon had just assumed the presidency, pledging to end the war with honor. However, he secretly expanded the conflict into Cambodia. When news of this clandestine expansion leaked, protests once again erupted. At Kent State University in Ohio, students gathered to demonstrate against the escalation. On May 4, 1970, the National Guard was deployed to control the crowd. What transpired next shocked the entire nation. Guardsmen opened fire, unleashing 67 bullets in just 13 seconds, resulting in 4 students dead and 9 wounded. One victim was merely walking to class, another was an ROTC student, none were armed. Photographs of the aftermath circulated globally, particularly one of a young woman kneeling beside a lifeless body, screaming in horror, which became an iconic image of the era. Suddenly, individuals who had never before participated in a protest found themselves asking, "How did we get here?" The Kent State shootings ignited an even more profound wave of outrage. Over 4 million students across the country initiated strikes, and hundreds of colleges shut down. It marked the largest student protest in U.S. history. Protests transcended mere opposition to Vietnam. They encompassed every grievance: civil rights, free speech, governmental deceit, the draft, racism, and pervasive injustice. Young people were unequivocally declaring, "We don't trust you anymore." They were asserting, "You're sending us to die and killing us when we speak out." And Kent State was not an isolated incident. Just 10 days later, on May 14, 1970, police opened fire on students at Jackson State College in Mississippi who were protesting racism and the war, killing 2 students and injuring 12. However, because Jackson State was a historically black college, the incident received considerably less national attention. Nevertheless, the message was starkly clear: America was in crisis. The nation's youth no longer reposed faith in its leaders, and those leaders no longer possessed the means to contain the burgeoning anger. This anger had been steadily accumulating for years. The Vietnam War was purportedly a fight for freedom. Yet many Americans increasingly perceived it as a deception, a war predicated on flawed information, questionable motives, and unceasing violence. The draft played a monumental role in exacerbating this anger. Young men were forcibly conscripted to fight in a war they fundamentally opposed. Poor and working-class youths were disproportionately drafted, while wealthier individuals, particularly those enrolled in college, adeptly discovered methods to avoid service. It felt inherently unfair, rigged, and only served to worsen an already volatile situation. By 1970, the anti-war movement had long transcended a fringe group. Its ranks now included students, veterans, mothers, teachers, and even some politicians. Marches in Washington, D.C. drew hundreds of thousands. Vietnam veterans also began protesting, defiantly casting their medals onto the Capitol steps. They were not cowards. They had fought. They had seen the horrors of the jungle. They had witnessed friends perish. And they returned home declaring, "This war is wrong." Kent State became a searing symbol, a symbol of the consequences when governments cease to listen, a symbol of how fear can turn deadly. A symbol of the profound cost not only in Vietnam but also domestically. For Nixon, the shootings represented a profound nightmare. While he initially defended the Guard's actions, privately he was shaken. He derisively labeled student protesters bums, but even his own staff reportedly cautioned him. "Sir, we are losing an entire generation." In the ensuing years, the war would relentlessly grind on, encompassing Cambodia, Laos, clandestine bombings, and unproductive peace talks. Yet, something fundamental had shifted in America. Trust was irrevocably broken. Faith in government, in leadership, in truth, it all began to unravel. And the war did not merely inflict harm upon those who fought it. It deeply damaged the very soul of the country. Some characterized the students at Kent State as rebels, others as heroes, but most simply asserted this: they were merely children, and they died in a war they were not even fighting. On a campus that should have been a sanctuary for free expression. Their names were Allison Krauss, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Schroer, and William Schroeder. They were 19 and 20 years old. Their lives were tragically cut short, and their deaths compelled America to confront a terrifying question: if we are killing our own children, what precisely are we fighting for? The echoes of that fateful day still reverberate. One can visit Kent State today. A memorial stands, a museum exists, and a quiet hill marks the spot where the shots rang out. But more than anything, in their silence, and in that silence, a profound lesson resides. Wars do not merely kill people overseas. They also destroy things at home. They shatter trust, they cleave generations. And they leave behind indelible scars that do not fade. The protests did not halt the war overnight, but they irrevocably transformed the national conversation. They compelled the country to confront its own reflection, and what it saw was profoundly broken. Chapter 14. Secrets and Scandals. The war had already exacted a devastating toll on the vibrant jungles of Vietnam and the very soul of America. However, in the early 1970s, the conflict took an even darker turn. Not because of escalating hostilities on the battlefield, but due to shocking revelations unfolding back home: secrets, lies, pervasive cover-ups, and egregious crimes, perpetrated not by the enemy, but by their own government and military. The public's long-held perceptions about Vietnam were on the verge of being utterly dismantled. First came the harrowing account of My Lai. It occurred on March 16, 1968, in a small village in South Vietnam, primarily inhabited by women, children, and elderly farmers, just another inconspicuous dot on the map in the boundless countryside. But on that fateful day, a contingent of U.S. soldiers from Charlie Company, young, enraged, and exhausted, entered the village on a search and destroy mission. They had been informed the village was teeming with Viet Cong, yet there were no enemy combatants, no weapons, no discernible threat. Nevertheless, what transpired was not a regrettable mistake. It was a premeditated massacre. The soldiers systematically rounded up unarmed civilians, shot them, raped women, killed children, and incinerated homes. Over 500 people, predominantly women and children, were slaughtered. And the world would have remained utterly oblivious had it not been for the courageous intervention of a helicopter crew. A pilot named Hugh Thompson witnessed the unfolding horror from the air. He landed his helicopter between the villagers and the soldiers and threatened to open fire on his own men if they did not cease their brutal actions. Thompson and his crew managed to save a handful of lives that day, but the damage was irrevocably done. After the massacre, the army attempted a comprehensive cover-up. Reports were falsified. Incriminating files were meticulously hidden, and the entire horrific narrative was swept under the rug. However, one young soldier, Ron Ridenauer, who had heard accounts of the atrocity from fellow troops, found himself unable to forget. He meticulously wrote letters to Congress, the Pentagon, and the media. It took over a year, but eventually, journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story in late 1969. The accompanying photographs were unspeakably horrifying: bodies piled in ditches, children lying face down in blood-soaked clothes. The American public was profoundly shocked. They had been assured that the U.S. military was defending freedom and protecting the innocent. Now, they witnessed something entirely different. Only one individual, Lieutenant William Calley, was ultimately convicted. He was sentenced to life imprisonment but was released after just 3 years under house arrest. Many were outraged. Some still defended him, but no one could deny the undeniable truth of what had occurred. My Lai shattered the cherished notion that America consistently played the role of the hero. And just when people believed they had witnessed the nadir of moral depravity, more uncomfortable truths began to leak out. In 1971, a former military analyst named Daniel Ellsberg walked into the offices of the New York Times bearing a trove of classified documents. It was a veritable bombshell. Thousands of pages of internal government reports, secret memos, military assessments, and intelligence briefings pertaining to the Vietnam War, dating back to the 1950s. These were the Pentagon Papers. What they revealed was utterly devastating. For years, successive American leaders, from President Truman to Johnson, had systematically lied. They had deliberately misled the public about the war's true purpose, its actual progress, and the genuine possibility of achieving victory. Even as they publicly assured the American people that triumph was imminent, they privately knew it was improbable. They were fully aware that the war would inevitably drag on, that more lives would be needlessly sacrificed, yet they continued to dispatch young men to their deaths regardless. The papers incontrovertibly demonstrated that the war was not merely a tragedy. It was a calculated deception. When the New York Times published the initial stories, the government retaliated fiercely. The Nixon administration demanded that the articles be suppressed, taking the newspaper to court and arguing that national security was at risk. However, in a landmark decision, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the press, asserting that freedom of the press must take precedence. Now, the Pentagon Papers were accessible to the public, and the damage was irreparable. Millions of Americans felt profoundly betrayed. They began to question everything, not just the war, but the very system that had ensnared them in it. Nixon, incandescent with fury, perceived Ellsberg as a national security threat and vowed to destroy him. Behind the scenes, he clandestinely established a group of operatives known as the Plumbers, whose mandate was to discredit Ellsberg and prevent future leaks. They brazenly broke into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist in search of incriminating information, illegally tapped phones, and flagrantly transgressed legal boundaries. These illicit actions would later explode into another monumental scandal, Watergate, but that is a distinct narrative. At that moment, the war in Vietnam continued to rage, but domestically, public trust in the government was rapidly collapsing. People were no longer merely protesting, they were profoundly disillusioned. Parents no longer believed the pronouncements of generals, soldiers no longer trusted the directives of their commanders, and reporters harbored deep suspicion towards the Pentagon. For many Americans, the true enemy was no longer located in Vietnam, it resided squarely in Washington. These scandals transcended mere news stories. They transmuted into potent symbols. My lie symbolized the profound moral decay of the war, while the Pentagon Papers embodied the egregious political betrayal. The impact was colossal. Recruitment numbers plummeted. Draft dodging proliferated, and Congress, embarrassed and enraged, began to push back. By the close of 1971, it was unequivocally clear that the war had lost its public support. Not due to a military defeat, but because of a pervasive crisis of truth. How could a nation continue to fight if it no longer believed in the fundamental justifications for its engagement? Even Nixon, who had once promised a secret plan to end the war, was now ensnared. He escalated the bombing campaign and attempted to negotiate peace. But the cumulative weight of the scandals eroded his position. America desperately sought an exit, but knew not how to withdraw without acknowledging defeat. Meanwhile, veterans continued to return home, but they were greeted not with parades or celebrations, but with a country that failed to comprehend their harrowing experiences. Some were derisively labeled baby killers, others were simply ignored. Many carried invisible wounds, trauma, guilt, confusion. Some struggled to maintain employment. Others suffered from chronic insomnia, and some tragically ended their own lives. The war had not merely broken a distant country, it had broken its own people. And now, with secrets exposed and faith irrevocably shattered, the war entered its final, brutal chapters. But not before one last surge of bombing, one last wave of negotiations, and one more desperate attempt to salvage something resembling victory. The end was approaching, but not yet. And in the oppressive shadows cast by every helicopter, behind every official speech, one haunting question relentlessly echoed: how did it come to this? Chapter 15: Vietnamization begins. After years of relentless bloodshed and pervasive scandal, the United States confronted an undeniable problem. The war in Vietnam showed no signs of ending, and the American people had reached their breaking point. In 1969, Richard Nixon ascended to the presidency, offering the country a singular promise: peace with honor. Yet, what did that elusive phrase truly signify? To many, it sounded like a viable exit strategy. To others, it was merely more empty rhetoric. In truth, Nixon understood that he could not achieve outright military victory in the war. However, he was equally unwilling to bear the historical distinction of being the first U.S. president to lose a war. Consequently, he devised a novel plan. Vietnamization, a lengthy term encapsulating a simple concept, gradually transferred the responsibility for fighting to the South Vietnamese, while slowly withdrawing American forces. On paper, it appeared to be a perfect solution: reduced U.S. involvement, increased responsibility for South Vietnam, and a clean exit. But in reality, nothing about it was clean. For while Nixon publicly espoused peace, he was simultaneously and secretly expanding the war. Let's dissect this. When Nixon assumed office, there were over 500,000 American troops deployed in Vietnam. The war had devolved into a political nightmare, and the revelations from scandals like My Lai and the Pentagon Papers had irrevocably shattered public trust in the mission. Domestically, anti-war protests surged in volume, encompassing college campuses, veterans, and even seasoned politicians. The entire country teetered on the brink. Nixon recognized that an abrupt withdrawal would precipitate chaos. So he initiated a gradual reduction of American troops. Concurrently, he significantly increased military aid to South Vietnam, providing weapons, helicopters, training, and financial resources, everything they would ostensibly require to stand independently. The South Vietnamese Army, officially known as the ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, was designated to become the primary force confronting the Communists. However, a significant problem persisted. The ARVN had been developed and had largely operated under the protective umbrella of American troops. Many of its soldiers lacked adequate training, morale was often low, and leadership was frequently deficient. Corruption was rampant, desertion rates were rising, and the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army remained formidable. Nixon believed that if he afforded the ARVN sufficient time, they would eventually be capable of holding the line. Thus, while he commenced a troop withdrawal, he simultaneously sought a means to swiftly weaken the enemy, and it was here that the situation took a darker turn. North Vietnam was not solely utilizing Vietnamese territory for its fight. They were moving men and supplies through a clandestine route that traversed neighboring countries, Cambodia and Laos. This intricate network was famously known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It served as the vital lifeline for the North's war effort. Consequently, Nixon resolved to sever this lifeline, but instead of seeking congressional approval or informing the American public, he did so in secret. In March 1969, Nixon initiated Operation Menu, a series of clandestine bombing campaigns within Cambodia. B-52 bombers soared high above the dense jungle, unleashing thousands of tons of explosives on targets suspected of being utilized by the Viet Cong. These bombings were assigned deceptive code names like breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack. The American public remained entirely oblivious, and even some officials within the Pentagon were kept in the dark. The rationale for such secrecy was clear: Cambodia was a neutral country, not officially involved in the war. Bombing it overtly could have ignited international outrage or, worse, sparked a broader conflict. Therefore, Nixon meticulously concealed these actions. These bombing raids were massive in scale. Entire villages were razed, tens of thousands of Cambodians were killed or displaced. And as the bombs rained down, another insidious consequence began to unfold. More and more Cambodians turned against their own government, which was already precariously weak. This would ultimately contribute to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, a brutal communist regime that would later perpetrate genocide in Cambodia. But that grim chapter was yet to come. For the moment, Nixon remained focused on his short-term objectives: crippling North Vietnam, accelerating peace talks, and extricating the U.S. from the conflict. By 1970, Nixon expanded the campaign even further, deploying U.S. and South Vietnamese troops into Cambodia in an attempt to eradicate Viet Cong bases. This invasion ignited a firestorm of protests back home. Americans were furious. Students demonstrated in every corner of the country, questioning why Nixon, who had promised to end the war, was instead expanding it. Then, a tragic event transpired at Kent State University in Ohio, when National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed students protesting the war, killing 4 students and wounding 9. The haunting images were indelibly etched into the national memory, students lying dead on the ground, others screaming in disbelief. It was a stark turning point. Americans belatedly realized that the war was not confined to the jungles of Asia. It was tearing apart their own nation. Meanwhile, Nixon attempted to justify his actions, asserting that the bombing and invasions were necessary to pressure North Vietnam into peace talks. He claimed that Vietnamization was succeeding, more U.S. troops were departing, and ARVN forces were stepping up. However, behind the scenes, doubts were mounting. Military commanders understood that the ARVN was far from ready, and the North Vietnamese were not relenting. In Laos, Nixon initiated another major operation in 1971, Operation Lam Son 719, an attempt by ARVN forces to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail within Laos. However, due to congressional restrictions, U.S. ground troops were prohibited from entering Laos directly. Consequently, the ARVN advanced alone, with only American air support. It was an unmitigated disaster. The ARVN were ambushed, overrun, and forced to retreat. Helicopters were shot down in droves, and thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers were killed or captured. This catastrophic failure exposed the harsh truth. Despite years of training and billions in aid, South Vietnam could not independently sustain the fight. Vietnamization was unraveling. Yet Nixon relentlessly pressed forward. Why? Because peace negotiations were underway in Paris, and Nixon believed that demonstrating military strength through bombing and escalation would afford him leverage at the negotiating table. He wanted the North to believe that America was not weak, even if it meant prolonging the war a little longer. In 1972, Nixon undertook one more dramatic maneuver. He launched Operation Linebacker, a potent bombing campaign targeting North Vietnamese cities, supply lines, and ports. This time, it was not a secret. It was a full-scale assault. The bombing continued into Christmas of 1972. Infamously known as the Christmas bombings, a final, desperate push to compel North Vietnam to sign a peace deal. Thousands perished, but the pressure ultimately proved effective. In January 1973, a peace agreement was finally signed. The U.S. consented to withdraw its last combat troops within 60 days, and in return, North Vietnam agreed to cease fighting, for the time being. Nixon declared it peace with honor, but most people understood the reality. It was simply a means of extrication. The U.S. had expended over a decade, billions of dollars, and thousands of lives only to conclude with an agreement that altered very little. South Vietnam remained fragile, the North remained strong, and the war was not truly over. So, what did Vietnamization truly accomplish? It bought time. It helped Nixon avoid the ignominious image of a defeated president. It fostered the illusion that South Vietnam possessed the capacity to stand independently. However, it also expanded the war, drawing in neighboring countries and leaving behind profound, enduring scars. Ultimately, the South Vietnamese would be compelled to confront the North alone, and in just 2 short years, their fate would be irrevocably sealed. But before the final collapse, there remained one more momentous event, a moment that would send shockwaves across the globe: the Fall of Saigon. Chapter 16: Cambodia and Chaos. The war in Vietnam was never an isolated conflict. Its tendrils consistently extended beyond its borders, weaving through jungles, traversing hidden trails, and spilling into nations not officially embroiled in the fighting. However, after 1969, one particular neighbor, Cambodia, would be violently drawn into the maelstrom, and the events that followed would etch one of the darkest chapters in Southeast Asian history. To comprehend the genesis of this tragedy, one must revisit the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This clandestine network served as the North Vietnamese Army's vital lifeline, winding through the territories of Laos and Cambodia, facilitating the movement of troops, weaponry, and supplies into South Vietnam, hidden beneath thick jungle canopies. It defied conventional border controls and diplomatic efforts to halt its operations. Consequently, when U.S. President Richard Nixon initiated his Vietnamization policy, he also made a critical determination: if the war could not be decisively won within Vietnam, perhaps it could be fought outside its confines. It was at this juncture that Cambodia transmuted into the next, unwitting battleground. Initially, the conflict unfolded in the shadows. In 1969, Nixon commenced secret bombing raids inside Cambodia, targeting areas believed to harbor Viet Cong forces. These bombings, part of Operation Menu, bore deceptive code names like breakfast, lunch, snack, and dinner. Each raid unleashed hundreds of tons of bombs upon Cambodian villages, forests, and farmland. The American public remained completely unaware, as did Congress, and even the majority of Nixon's own administration. He meticulously maintained secrecy, fearing that opening a new front in the war would trigger severe domestic backlash. However, the truth possesses an undeniable propensity for emergence, and when the bombings were eventually revealed, they profoundly shocked the world. Cambodia, at the time, was officially a neutral country. Its leader, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, had diligently strived to keep his nation out of the conflict by shrewdly playing both sides, allowing North Vietnamese troops limited passage while simultaneously endeavoring to maintain internal peace. But Nixon's relentless bombings and growing U.S. pressure began to destabilize the already fragile Cambodian government. In 1970, everything irrevocably changed. Sihanouk was overthrown in a coup orchestrated by General Lon Nol, who seized power with discreet support from the United States. Lon Nol swiftly aligned Cambodia with the West and demanded the immediate withdrawal of North Vietnamese troops. This proved to be a perilous miscalculation. The North Vietnamese responded by entrenching themselves even deeper, and a brutal civil war erupted within Cambodia. On one side stood Lon Nol's Cambodian government and army, bolstered by U.S. backing. On the other, a shadowy communist group known as the Khmer Rouge, supported by North Vietnam. Most Americans had never even heard of them. But they would soon become infamously synonymous with something truly horrifying. The Khmer Rouge was led by a man named Pol Pot. He was unlike other revolutionaries. His ambition extended beyond merely seizing power. He harbored a chilling vision: to utterly obliterate Cambodia's entire modern society and reconstruct it from a pristine, agrarian foundation. To achieve this, he believed it was imperative to destroy everything: cities, schools, religion, money, technology, even the fundamental unit of families. It sounded impossible, unthinkable. Yet within 5 years, he would attempt to realize precisely that, resulting in the deaths of millions. As the Civil War raged, Nixon made an audacious move. In April 1970, U.S. and South Vietnamese troops invaded Cambodia. They asserted it was a brief, limited operation, solely intended to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines. However, the reality proved far more chaotic. Tens of thousands of American and ARVN soldiers crossed the border, igniting fierce fighting. Villages were bombed, civilians fled in panic, and the invasion sparked massive protests back in the United States. People vehemently questioned: if Nixon promised to end the war, why was he expanding it? The protests culminated in a tragic peak at Kent State University, where 4 students were fatally shot during an anti-war demonstration. Back in Cambodia, the war was tearing the country apart. Lon Nol's government grew progressively weaker and more corrupt, while the Khmer Rouge gained strength and became increasingly ruthless. By 1973, U.S. ground troops had withdrawn from Cambodia. But the bombing campaign persisted. From 1970 to 1973, the U.S. dropped more bombs on Cambodia than it had during all of World War II, over 2.7 million tons. Entire towns were reduced to rubble. Farms and rice fields were scorched, and tens of thousands of Cambodians were killed. Many survivors, traumatized and enraged, joined the Khmer Rouge, perceiving them as the only force capable of fighting back. By 1975, the war within Cambodia reached its breaking point. Lon Nol's army collapsed, and the Khmer Rouge marched triumphantly into the capital, Phnom Penh. Initially, the populace cheered, believing the war had finally ended. However, they were tragically unaware of the horrors that awaited them. Within hours of seizing the city, Khmer Rouge soldiers began ordering people from their homes. "Leave the city," they commanded. "You'll come back soon." But no one ever returned. Children, parents, grandparents, the sick, the elderly, everyone was forcibly marched into the countryside at gunpoint. The Khmer Rouge embarked on building their perfect society, a twisted, dystopian vision of communism where cities were emptied, religion was banned, and everyone was forced into labor camps. People were compelled to toil in the fields from sunrise to sunset. Speaking out meant death. Reading a book meant death. Wearing glasses could mean death, as it signified education. The Khmer Rouge designated this new era, Year Zero. They systematically erased history, murdering teachers, doctors, engineers, anyone capable of independent thought. And then they turned on their own, enacting purges, executions, torture, and widespread starvation. By the time it was over, more than 2 million Cambodians had perished, nearly a quarter of the entire population. It stands as one of the most horrific genocides of the 20th century, and it originated, in part, because the Vietnam War spilled over into Cambodia, because bombs intended for someone else struck innocent people, because secret wars invariably have real, devastating consequences. It is crucial to acknowledge that the U.S. did not directly cause the rise of the Khmer Rouge, but the chaos, the bombings, and the ensuing civil war all contributed to their ascent. By the mid-1970s, Cambodia lay in ruins, as did Laos, which had also endured a secret war orchestrated by the CIA, utilizing local tribes to combat the North Vietnamese. Together, these nations, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, had been ravaged by decades of conflict, leaving entire generations lost, families shattered, cities annihilated, and hope extinguished. And still, the Vietnam War was not quite over. For as South Vietnam desperately clung to existence, the North was meticulously preparing for one final, decisive push. It would come swiftly, culminating in the indelible image of helicopters lifting off rooftops in a city that once stood strong. That is the next chapter. Chapter 17. Kent State and the Breaking Point. Student protests escalated to deadly confrontations, and America's youth, now rebels, sensed that the war had spiraled too far from its initial objectives. Too far into territories it was never meant to touch. And now, it had returned home. In April 1970, Americans turned on their televisions to a shocking news report. The war in Vietnam had clandestinely expanded into Cambodia. After years of protests, after numerous promises of peace, President Richard Nixon had ordered U.S. troops to invade a neutral country. To many Americans, especially the younger generation, this felt like a profound betrayal. Nixon had pledged to end the war, yet it appeared he was dragging the nation deeper into the quagmire. This betrayal would ignite a firestorm across college campuses, manifested in fervent protests, rhythmic chants, and impassioned marches. But on one particular campus, the simmering anger tragically transmuted into bloodshed, and 4 young lives were senselessly extinguished. It began with a speech. On April 30, 1970, Nixon appeared on national television, informing the country that U.S. forces were now operating in Cambodia, targeting the headquarters of the entire communist military operation. To his supporters, it resonated as a bold and decisive move. To his critics, it signaled an alarming escalation. The very next day, college campuses across the nation erupted in protest. At Kent State University in Ohio, students gathered to demonstrate against the invasion. They chanted slogans, held signs, and defiantly burned copies of the U.S. Constitution, symbolizing their belief that the government was betraying its fundamental promises. By May 1st, the protests had intensified. Some students clashed with police in downtown Kent. A few hurled bottles and rocks, trash cans were overturned, and windows were smashed. The local mayor, fearing the situation was spiraling out of control, summoned the Ohio National Guard. By May 2nd, National Guard troops were deployed on campus, armed with rifles and tear gas. Tensions rapidly escalated. That evening, the ROTC building, representing the military on campus, was set ablaze by protesters. No one was physically harmed, but the symbolism was loud and clear. The military was unwelcome, the war was unwelcome. And now, the fuse had been irrevocably lit. On the morning of May 4, 1970, students once again assembled for a protest. Approximately 2,000 individuals, students, curious bystanders, and some faculty members, stood on a grassy hill near the center of campus. The National Guard, a contingent of about 100 fully equipped troops, ordered them to disperse. The students defiantly refused, shouting back and some throwing rocks and tear gas canisters. Some were merely observing the events unfold. Then came the moment no one could have anticipated. Just after noon, a group of guardsmen suddenly turned and opened fire into the crowd. The barrage lasted just 13 seconds. In that brief, horrific span, they fired 67 rounds. When the smoke cleared, 4 students lay dead, and 9 others were wounded. Some were active protesters, but others were not even involved. Some were simply walking to class. America was stunned. Photographs of the shooting, especially one depicting a young woman kneeling and screaming beside a lifeless body, saturated newspapers, magazines, and television screens. It became horrifyingly clear that the war was no longer merely tearing apart Southeast Asia. It was tearing apart America itself. People agonizingly questioned, how did it come to this? How did young Americans, armed only with signs, end up dead at the hands of their own soldiers? The Kent State shooting was not merely a tragedy, it was a profound turning point. It marked the precise moment when the generational chasm, the deep cultural rift between young people and those in power, split wide open. Across the country, students walked out of classes. Over 4 million students went on strike, and more than 50 campuses shut down. It represented the largest student protest in U.S. history. Protests were no longer solely about Vietnam. They encompassed every grievance: civil rights, free speech, governmental lies, the draft, racism, and pervasive injustice. Young people were unequivocally declaring, "We don't trust you anymore." They were asserting, "You're sending us to die and killing us when we speak out." And Kent State was not an isolated incident. Just 10 days later, on May 14, 1970, police opened fire on students at Jackson State College in Mississippi who were protesting racism and the war, killing 2 students and injuring 12. However, because Jackson State was a historically black college, the incident received considerably less national attention. Nevertheless, the message was starkly clear: America was in crisis. The nation's youth no longer reposed faith in its leaders, and those leaders no longer possessed the means to contain the burgeoning anger. This anger had been steadily accumulating for years. The Vietnam War was purportedly a fight for freedom, yet many Americans increasingly perceived it as a deception, a war predicated on flawed information, questionable motives, and unceasing violence. The draft played a monumental role in exacerbating this anger. Young men were forcibly conscripted to fight in a war they fundamentally opposed. Poor and working-class youths were disproportionately drafted, while wealthier individuals, particularly those enrolled in college, adeptly discovered methods to avoid service. It felt inherently unfair, rigged, and only served to worsen an already volatile situation. By 1970, the anti-war movement had long transcended a fringe group. Its ranks now included students, veterans, mothers, teachers, and even some politicians. Marches in Washington, D.C. drew hundreds of thousands. Vietnam veterans also began protesting, defiantly casting their medals onto the Capitol steps. They were not cowards. They had fought, they had seen the horrors of the jungle, they had witnessed friends perish. And they returned home declaring, "This war is wrong." Kent State became a searing symbol, a symbol of the consequences when governments cease to listen, a symbol of how fear can turn deadly. A symbol of the profound cost not only in Vietnam but also domestically. For Nixon, the shootings represented a profound nightmare. While he initially defended the Guard's actions, privately he was shaken. He derisively labeled student protesters bums, but even his own staff reportedly cautioned him. "Sir, we are losing an entire generation." In the ensuing years, the war would relentlessly grind on, encompassing Cambodia, Laos, clandestine bombings, and unproductive peace talks. Yet, something fundamental had shifted in America. Trust was irrevocably broken. Faith in government, in leadership, in truth, it all began to unravel. And the war did not merely inflict harm upon those who fought it. It deeply damaged the very soul of the country. Some characterized the students at Kent State as rebels, others as heroes, but most simply asserted this: they were merely children, and they died in a war they were not even fighting. On a campus that should have been a sanctuary for free expression. Their names were Allison Krauss, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Scheuer, and William Schroeder. They were 19 and 20 years old. Their lives were tragically cut short, and their deaths compelled America to confront a terrifying question: if we are killing our own children, what precisely are we fighting for? The echoes of that fateful day still reverberate. One can visit Kent State today. A memorial stands, a museum exists, and a quiet hill marks the spot where the shots rang out. But more than anything, in their silence, and in that silence, a profound lesson resides. Wars do not merely kill people overseas. They also destroy things at home. They shatter trust, they cleave generations, and they leave behind indelible scars that do not fade. The protests did not halt the war overnight, but they irrevocably transformed the national conversation. They compelled the country to confront its own reflection, and what it saw was profoundly broken. Chapter 18: Peace Talks and Power Plays. By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War had relentlessly dragged on for nearly 2 decades. Thousands of lives had been tragically lost, millions more were displaced. And the immense cost, both in financial terms and human spirit, was staggering. The American public was utterly exhausted, the soldiers enduring the harsh realities of the jungle were exhausted. And even the leaders in Washington, Hanoi, and Saigon were similarly drained. The war had devolved into a seemingly insurmountable stalemate. Either side could lay claim to a definitive victory. Yet neither side was willing to concede defeat. Amidst this grim deadlock, a faint glimmer of hope began to emerge in the form of peace talks. For years, there had been sporadic attempts at negotiation, but none had yielded lasting results. Now, in 1968, following the profound shock of the Tet Offensive, both sides recognized the inherent value in engaging in dialogue. These crucial negotiations would come to be known as the Paris Peace Talks. They commenced in May 1968. In the heart of France's capital, a city renowned for its diplomacy, art, and rich history. The talks brought together 4 primary participants: the United States, representing South Vietnam; the North Vietnamese government, including the Viet Cong, advocating for reunification; the South Vietnamese government, led by President Nguyen Van Thieu, and the National Liberation Front, the political arm of the Viet Cong. The negotiation room was permeated with palpable tension. These were not cordial discussions. Each side arrived armed with uncompromising demands. Profound suspicion, and an extensive catalog of grievances. For the United States, the objective was straightforward: withdraw American troops while simultaneously ensuring the independence of South Vietnam and its freedom from communist rule. For North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, their objective was equally clear: compel the U.S. to withdraw, reunify the country under communist control, and terminate what they vehemently labeled American imperialism. The talks commenced with a flurry of rhetorical pronouncements, impassioned speeches, and mutual accusations, yet substantive progress remained agonizingly slow. One of the primary points of contention revolved around the ceasefire. North Vietnam demanded a complete ceasefire, with U.S. troops withdrawing immediately. The U.S., conversely, sought a ceasefire only after specific conditions were met, such as a cessation of communist attacks. Another significant obstacle concerned the future of South Vietnam. North Vietnam insisted on political control or, at the very least, the presence of their representatives within the South. The U.S. and South Vietnam steadfastly refused to entertain any proposals that would jeopardize the South Vietnamese government's authority. Behind the scenes, the negotiations devolved into a convoluted game of power plays and deliberate stalling tactics. At times, negotiators seemed more preoccupied with scoring political points than with genuinely forging peace. American diplomats frequently employed delaying tactics to buy time for the U.S. military to continue its operations. North Vietnamese negotiators, at other junctures, flatly rejected proposals, hoping to gradually wear down the Americans. It was a perilous dance, one that deeply frustrated many external observers. Despite the pervasive tension, a few minor agreements were eventually reached. There was a mutual understanding to halt bombing in certain areas, referred to as bombing halts, but these agreements were frequently violated. Prisoner exchanges emerged as a small, albeit significant, symbol of goodwill. Thousands of American prisoners of war, POWs, were held captive in North Vietnam, and negotiators fiercely debated the modalities and timing of their release. At one point, the U.S. demanded the immediate release of all prisoners as a precondition for the continuation of peace talks. North Vietnam unequivocally refused. Years would elapse before any tangible progress was made on this deeply emotional issue. Meanwhile, the war on the ground continued its relentless course. In South Vietnam, fierce fighting raged as soldiers battled through rice paddies, jungles, and villages. In Washington, President Nixon and his administration pursued a clandestine strategy: Vietnamization. The core idea was to progressively transfer control of the war to South Vietnamese forces while systematically withdrawing American troops. However, at the negotiating table, the U.S. still held significant leverage. Bombing campaigns intensified, specifically designed to pressure North Vietnam into agreeing to U.S. terms. One of the most controversial moments during the peace talks was the Christmas bombing of 1972, officially known as Operation Linebacker II. This entailed a massive bombing campaign over North Vietnam, lasting for 11 days, during which American B-52 bombers unleashed thousands of tons of bombs on Hanoi and Haiphong. The objective was to force North Vietnam back to the negotiating table and compel them to accept the U.S. terms. However, the bombing resulted in immense destruction and substantial civilian casualties, shocking the world and further exacerbating divisions of opinion regarding the war. Following the Christmas bombing, North Vietnam ultimately returned to the negotiating table. By January 1973, negotiators achieved a breakthrough. The Paris Peace Accords were formally signed on January 27, 1973. The agreement encompassed several key provisions: a ceasefire across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the withdrawal of all U.S. combat troops within 60 days, the return of all prisoners of war, and a recognition of the political status quo, meaning South Vietnam would remain independent until reunification negotiations could proceed peacefully. A framework for future political settlements between North and South Vietnam was also established. Initially, the accords were hailed as a victory. Thousands of American troops began their journey home, and POWs were released and joyously reunited with their families. However, beneath the veneer of celebration lay profound, underlying problems. The ceasefire proved exceptionally fragile. Violations occurred almost immediately, with both sides accusing each other of breaking the agreement. North Vietnamese troops, still organized and highly motivated, continued to press their offensive in the south, gradually expanding their control over more rural areas through guerrilla tactics and conventional military forces. South Vietnam's President Nguyen Van Thi refused to cooperate fully with the terms, fearing communist infiltration and a loss of power. North Vietnam, meanwhile, continued its military build-up in the south, and fighting quietly resumed, even though the U.S. was no longer directly involved. The peace talks had formally ended American involvement in the war, but they had not brought true peace to Vietnam. Many Americans felt betrayed. They had been told peace was imminent and longed for the war to conclude, but the reality proved far more complex. The accords represented a temporary truce, not an enduring peace. The real struggle for Vietnam's future was yet to come. Meanwhile, Washington grappled with the profound fallout. The war had irrevocably transformed American politics. Congress enacted legislation to curtail the president's authority to wage war without legislative approval. The War Powers Act of 1973, a direct consequence of the Vietnam War, mandated that the president consult Congress before deploying troops into combat. This was a clear indication that the Vietnam War had fundamentally reshaped America's perceptions of military power and democratic accountability. In Vietnam, the fragile peace endured for only a few years, but by 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a major offensive. Without the direct support of the U.S. military, South Vietnam's government swiftly collapsed. On April 30, 1975, Saigon fell. The Vietnam War was finally over. However, the peace talks, while ending direct U.S. involvement, proved incapable of resolving the deep-seated divisions and conflicts that had torn the country apart. They served as a stark reminder that diplomacy is rarely straightforward. Behind closed doors, the participants negotiated deals, bargained for strategic advantages, and endeavored to mold the future of a divided nation. Some viewed the Paris Peace Accords as a necessary step towards ending a brutal conflict, while others perceived them as a flawed attempt that merely postponed the inevitable. The legacy of the peace talks is complex. They embody the enduring hope for peace, the devastating cost of war, and the inherent limits of power. As Vietnam embarked on its path forward, the world watched intently, absorbing lessons that would influence diplomacy and warfare for generations to come. Chapter 19: The Ceasefire That Wasn't. Following the withdrawal of U.S. troops, the fighting in Vietnam, rather than ceasing, continued relentlessly, leaving South Vietnam hanging by a perilous thread. The signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973 had initially ignited hope for many. After years of brutal conflict, it seemed the war might finally be nearing its conclusion. American troops commenced their withdrawal, and the promise of peace felt tangibly real for the first time in a long while. However, this ceasefire, this ostensibly fragile agreement, was far from what it appeared. Almost immediately, the ceasefire began to unravel. The guns did not fall silent. Instead, fighting continued in some areas with even greater ferocity than before. The promise of peace quickly dissolved, giving way to a new kind of war, one without American soldiers on the ground, yet no less deadly. South Vietnam, now isolated in the struggle, was precariously close to collapse. The year 1973 officially marked the end of direct U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. More than 500,000 American troops had already returned home. And by March 1973, the last combat soldiers had departed Vietnamese soil. For many Americans, the war was over. But for the Vietnamese people, the conflict had not ended. The Paris Peace Accords included a ceasefire clause, but this ceasefire was shaky at best, more of a suggestion than a firm, enforceable promise. Both sides accused each other of violating the ceasefire almost from day one. North Vietnamese troops, still highly organized and motivated, continued to press their offensive in the south. They gradually expanded their control over more rural areas, utilizing both guerrilla tactics and regular military forces. South Vietnamese soldiers, under President Nguyen Van Thieu's leadership, struggled desperately to maintain control. Their forces were inadequately supplied, their morale was severely demoralized, and they were weakened after years of continuous warfare. The American financial and military support that had once been the bedrock of South Vietnam's strength was rapidly diminishing. Congress had drastically cut aid as public anger over the war intensified back home. Without U.S. air power and ground support, South Vietnam was forced to wage war on its own terms. And it was utterly unprepared. Many South Vietnamese soldiers were young and inexperienced, thrust into a brutal war zone with insufficient training or morale. Corruption permeated among military leaders and government officials, further debilitating the South Vietnamese war effort from within. Meanwhile, North Vietnam expertly exploited the evolving situation. They perceived the ceasefire not as a step towards genuine peace, but as a strategic pause to regroup and bolster their forces. Fresh troops poured into the south via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the complex network of paths and tunnels weaving through Laos and Cambodia. Supplies flowed steadily, and the Viet Cong insurgency in the south grew progressively stronger. They orchestrated attacks and ambushes, frequently vanishing into the dense jungle before South Vietnamese forces could effectively respond. In urban centers, North Vietnamese sympathizers and agents worked diligently to undermine the government from within. The fragile truce was a thin veil, barely concealing the harsh reality of ongoing conflict. For ordinary Vietnamese civilians, the war continued to mean pervasive uncertainty, constant fear, and devastating loss. Villages caught between the two warring factions frequently became battlegrounds, forcing families to flee their homes and become refugees. Millions were displaced by the ceaseless violence. In the United States, the war was increasingly relegated to the background, supplanted by new political crises and social movements. But for those still fighting in Vietnam, the war remained a daily, brutal reality. President Nixon had promised peace with honor, but true peace proved elusive. In 1974, the situation deteriorated rapidly. North Vietnam launched a large-scale offensive, distinct from previous guerrilla tactics, known as the Easter Offensive. This was a conventional assault, involving substantial numbers of tanks, artillery, and troops moving openly against South Vietnamese positions. The South Vietnamese army fought valiantly, supported by limited American airstrikes and military aid. But the offensive starkly exposed serious weaknesses within South Vietnam's military. Some provinces swiftly fell, and panic spread rapidly among civilians. The American public remained largely unaware of the full extent of the fighting. Following the Watergate scandal and Nixon's resignation in August 1974, U.S. political attention shifted inward. President Gerald Ford assumed office during a time of profound crisis. He lobbied Congress for increased military and economic aid to South Vietnam, but Congress was reluctant, still haunted by the immense cost and perceived failure of the war. Aid was severely limited and often delayed. Without sufficient support, South Vietnam struggled to mount an effective defense. North Vietnam continued its relentless push throughout 1974 and early 1975, steadily gaining ground. Major cities and provinces fell one by one. South Vietnam's government became increasingly unstable. President Thieu's leadership was heavily criticized for rampant corruption and poor strategic decisions. Morale among soldiers and civilians plummeted, and reports of desertion and rebellion within the South Vietnamese army dramatically increased. In early 1975, North Vietnam launched its final, decisive push, the Spring Offensive. They targeted the Central Highlands and rapidly advanced towards Saigon. The South Vietnamese forces collapsed under the overwhelming pressure. Thousands of soldiers surrendered or fled. The world watched as South Vietnam's last defenses crumbled. The ceasefire that was supposed to bring peace had become a distant, cruel memory. The war continued with greater intensity and desperation than ever before. On April 21, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the outskirts of Saigon. The South Vietnamese government was in utter disarray. President Thia had already resigned and fled the country. His successor, General Duong Van Minh, attempted to negotiate a peaceful surrender to prevent further bloodshed, but North Vietnamese forces made it unequivocally clear that they intended a full takeover. 2 days later, on April 30th, the city fell. The American embassy was evacuated in a hurried and chaotic airlift. The Vietnam War was finally over, but at a terrible, incalculable cost. Millions of Vietnamese were dead, wounded, or displaced. The country was left divided and utterly devastated. The ceasefire had failed because the deep-seated political and military conflicts were never genuinely resolved. Both sides perceived the truce as an opportunity to gain advantage rather than a legitimate step towards peace. The legacy of the ceasefire serves as a stark reminder that wars do not always conclude with neat, tidy agreements. Sometimes the battles persist long after the guns are supposed to have fallen silent. South Vietnam's fragile hold on independence was shattered, and Vietnam would be reunified under communist rule. The American people were left to grapple with the profound meaning of a war that had demanded so much. For the Vietnamese, the years following the ceasefire were a period of arduous rebuilding, but also of enduring pain and poignant memory. The ceasefire that wasn't demonstrated that peace agreements without fundamental trust and robust enforcement are inherently fragile. It imparted crucial lessons to the world about diplomacy, warfare, and the immense human cost of conflict. Chapter 20. The Fall of Saigon. The spring of 1975 was a period defined by desperation and a final, brutal reckoning. North Vietnamese forces were rapidly advancing towards Saigon, the vibrant capital of South Vietnam. For years, Saigon had served as the political, military, and economic heart of South Vietnam. Now, it stood on the precipice of its fall. The fall of Saigon irrevocably marked the conclusion of a long and bitter war that had profoundly shaped the lives of millions and forever altered the global landscape. As the North Vietnamese army tightened its grip, panic rippled through South Vietnamese officials and civilians alike. The city, once bustling and vibrant, transformed into a scene of chaos and profound fear. The American government, after years of deep involvement, was now frantically preparing for a swift and desperate evacuation. For the United States, the fall of Saigon was not merely a military defeat but a profound national trauma. After expending billions of dollars and jeopardizing thousands of American lives, the U.S. was compelled to abandon its ally and relinquish the country to its inevitable fate. The evacuation plan, codenamed Operation Frequent Wind, became the largest helicopter evacuation in recorded history. Thousands of Americans, South Vietnamese military personnel, government officials, and their families were airlifted from rooftops and military bases across Saigon. Scenes of helicopters hovering precariously over the city, landing on the U.S. Embassy rooftop, became iconic and enduring images of the war's chaotic and ignominious end. People clung desperately to the helicopters, yearning for a chance to escape. But many who desired to flee were tragically left behind. The streets were choked with terrified South Vietnamese civilians, many of whom had openly supported the U.S. or the South Vietnamese government, now gripped by the overwhelming fear of retribution from the North Vietnamese communists. Families frantically attempted to gather their meager possessions and join the frenzied evacuation. The American embassy became a nexus of frantic activity, as staff tirelessly worked to process evacuation papers and organize flights. In the final days before the city's collapse, the South Vietnamese government was in a state of complete breakdown. President Nguyen Van Thia had already resigned and fled the country. His successor, General Duong Van Minh, attempted to negotiate a peaceful surrender to avert further bloodshed, but North Vietnamese forces made it unequivocally clear that they intended a complete takeover. April 30th, 1975, is forever etched in history as the day Saigon fell. At dawn, North Vietnamese tanks breached the city's gates. Soldiers marched unopposed into government buildings, raised the red flag of communism, and declared a definitive victory. The sounds of gunfire and explosions reverberated through the streets. For many South Vietnamese, the war's conclusion was not a relief, but the ominous beginning of a new nightmare. Thousands were arrested, summarily sent to re-education camps, or forcibly compelled to flee their homeland. Vietnam was officially reunified under the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The war, which had spanned 2 decades and claimed millions of lives, was at last over. The Fall of Saigon. While a moment of profound sorrow for those who had fought and lost, also heralded the commencement of a new chapter for Vietnam. The country confronted immense challenges. The war had left the land utterly devastated, cities and villages were in ruins, the economy lay shattered, and millions were dead, with millions more wounded or displaced. The new government embarked on the formidable task of rebuilding the country under communist rule. Extensive efforts were undertaken to unify the North and South, both politically and economically. Yet the scars of war remained deep and pervasive. Families were torn apart, and individuals who had once been allies found themselves on opposing sides. Many South Vietnamese who had supported the American-backed government faced relentless persecution. In the years following the fall of Saigon, a massive exodus of refugees commenced. Infamously known as the Boat People, hundreds of thousands risked perilous sea voyages to escape the new regime, with many tragically perishing at sea, victims of brutal storms, merciless pirates, or dangerously overcrowded boats. Those who survived often endured immense hardship in refugee camps before being eventually accepted by other countries. The United States welcomed hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees, many of whom forged new lives far from the war zone. However, the pain of losing Vietnam continued to linger. The fall of Saigon represented a bitter chapter in American history, symbolizing the inherent limits of American power and the profound consequences of a long and deeply controversial war. The indelible images of helicopters lifting off the embassy rooftop, desperate crowds, and abandoned streets became powerful symbols of defeat and loss. But for Vietnam, it was simultaneously a moment of hope and the arduous beginning of reconstruction. Over time, Vietnam slowly recovered. Trade relations opened with other countries, and the economy began to steadily grow again. Today, Vietnam stands as a unified country, boasting a rich culture and a history profoundly shaped by the struggles of its past. The fall of Saigon remains a potent reminder of the immeasurable human cost of war. It teaches us that behind every headline and political decision are real people, with their hopes, their fears, and lives irrevocably changed forever. The Vietnam War may have officially ended on April 30th, 1975, but its enduring lessons continue to resonate deeply. Chapter 21. What was lost? The Vietnam War officially concluded in 1975, yet its profound consequences lingered for decades, long after the final shots were fired. What was irrevocably lost during this brutal conflict cannot be measured solely by the number of years it endured or the battles that were fought. It is a harrowing narrative of human suffering on an incomprehensibly massive scale. Over 3 million people perished during the Vietnam War, civilians, soldiers, and innocent bystanders caught in the merciless crossfire of a conflict they did not choose. For every life tragically extinguished, countless others were forever altered, families torn asunder, bodies broken, and minds scarred. The human toll was staggering. In South Vietnam alone, an estimated 2 million civilians lost their lives. Many succumbed in battles, while others were victims of relentless bombing campaigns or caught in the indiscriminate crossfire of guerrilla warfare. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong also suffered immense casualties, with military deaths numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Every village, Every town across Vietnam was profoundly affected. The United States lost over 58,000 soldiers. However, mere numbers convey only a fraction of the story. More than 300,000 American soldiers were wounded, some permanently. Many returned home burdened by invisible wounds. Suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, struggling desperately to readjust to life after the war. The war left deep psychological scars on both sides. Vietnamese civilians lived in perpetual fear. The jungles and countryside were riddled with treacherous landmines, unexploded bombs, and insidious booby traps. Merely walking outside could mean sudden, violent death. Thousands of children were orphaned, and entire communities were displaced as their villages were destroyed to make way for military bases or relentless bombing runs. The war also irrevocably tore apart families and communities. Vietnamese families were cruelly divided between the North and South. Some chose to flee, while others were forcibly compelled to remain. Neighbors who had once coexisted peacefully suddenly found themselves on opposing sides, sometimes turning against each other with tragic consequences. After the war, many South Vietnamese individuals faced persecution for their real or perceived ties to the old government or the United States. Re-education camps, transmuted into prisons, where thousands were held in harsh, inhumane conditions. These camps purportedly aimed to change minds, but more often they shattered spirits. The very land itself bore the indelible marks of war. The once lush jungles that covered Vietnam were scarred by years of relentless bombing and defoliation campaigns. The U.S. military indiscriminately dropped millions of gallons of Agent Orange, a chemical specifically designed to kill plants and strip away forest cover from the enemy. While effective in clearing vegetation, it left behind a toxic and enduring legacy. Agent Orange contaminated the soil and water, and it caused severe health problems for generations, including various cancers, horrific birth defects, and other debilitating illnesses. The devastating effects of this chemical warfare are still acutely felt today. Villages and farmland were annihilated. Land that had been meticulously cultivated for centuries became unusable. Many people lost their livelihoods, and critical infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and schools were extensively damaged or utterly destroyed, setting back development for years. The war also generated millions of refugees. Those who survived often fled their homes in desperate search of safety. Some escaped by perilous boat journeys, confronting dangerous seas and uncertain futures. These refugees became globally known as the Boat People. Many countries around the world offered refuge, and the United States welcomed hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees, many of whom successfully started new lives far from the ravages of the war zone. However, for those left behind, the loss transcended mere land or possessions. It was a profound loss of hope and the very essence of a normal life. Millions grappled with overwhelming grief and trauma. They lost loved ones' homes, and the futures they had so ardently dreamed of. In the United States, the war also cleaved deep divisions. Returning veterans frequently encountered hostility or indifference. Many were haunted by indelible memories of what they had witnessed or been compelled to do. Families struggled to comprehend the profound pain their loved ones carried. The war fundamentally altered America's perception of itself and its role in the global arena. It was the first time in modern history that television directly brought brutal, unvarnished images of war into people's homes. The nightly news broadcasts depicted graphic scenes of battle, fervent protests, and agonizing suffering. For many Americans, the war transmuted into a powerful symbol of failure and immense loss. It ignited intense debates over foreign policy and the inherent limits of military power that continue to resonate deeply today. For Vietnam, the war's legacy is both tragic and profoundly complex. The country was forced to undertake a monumental effort to rebuild from the ruins, physically, politically, and socially. Yet, despite the pervasive devastation, Vietnam discovered pathways to healing. Efforts were diligently made to reunite the country, and restore its ravaged economy. Today, Vietnam boasts one of the fastest growing economies in Southeast Asia, a testament to its remarkable resilience. However, the memories of war persist. Memorials stand across Vietnam and the world, honoring those who sacrificed their lives. The scars on the land serve as a stark reminder to new generations of the immense cost of conflict. And for countless families, the loss remains intensely personal and ongoing. Vietnamese and American families alike continue to remember those who never returned home. The Vietnam War was more than a battle for territory or ideology. It was a human tragedy replete with immense loss and pervasive pain. Its impact stretched far beyond the battlefields, permeating the hearts and minds of millions. As we reflect, we remember the cost, not merely in numbers, but in lives irrevocably transformed. Understanding what was lost constitutes a crucial step towards healing and peace. It reminds us why war must always be the absolute last resort, and why its devastating effects linger long after the guns fall silent. Chapter 22: POWs and MIA, the Forgotten Soldiers. For many, the Vietnam War did not conclude in 1975. For some families, it tragically never truly ended at all. There were the soldiers who returned home, and those who did not. Some were killed and buried, while others vanished without a trace. And then there were those who were captured, held as prisoners of war, POWs, under brutal, clandestine conditions. These men, the POWs and the MIAs, missing in action, represent one of the most agonizing chapters of the Vietnam conflict. They became profound symbols of sacrifice, of unimaginable suffering, and, most tragically, of pervasive silence. From the early years of the war, American servicemen were captured by North Vietnamese forces and the Viet Cong. They were frequently pilots, shot down during bombing missions over North Vietnam, or soldiers taken during ambushes or raids. These men were often marched for miles, frequently barefoot and bleeding, deep into enemy territory. They were confined in small, dark cells, sometimes underground, sometimes in rudimentary bamboo cages. Some ended up in a place that would become infamous, Hoa Lo Prison, grimly nicknamed by the Americans as the Hanoi Hilton. It was anything but a hotel. It was a place of profound pain. Inside the Hanoi Hilton, POWs endured constant interrogations, starvation, and extreme isolation. Their captors sought forced confessions, incriminating statements, and propaganda footage to demonstrate to the world that America's war effort was faltering. And when the men refused to cooperate, the beatings commenced. One prisoner, who would later become U.S. Senator John McCain, was shot down over Hanoi in 1967. He suffered broken arms and a shattered leg but was denied proper medical care and nearly died. He spent over 5 years in captivity, 2 of them in solitary confinement. McCain was one of hundreds of American POWs held during the war. Their days blurred into weeks, and their weeks into years. They communicated through walls using coded messages, memorized lists of names so that if one man escaped, he could inform the world who was still alive inside. They clung to routines, discipline, and small acts of resistance to survive. Some were tortured so brutally they could no longer move properly. Some never returned. Back home, their families waited, their hope a fragile ember. Many received official letters stating their loved one was missing. Some were informed they had been captured, while others received no information at all. The government often lacked definitive answers, and some families endured years of agonizing uncertainty, simply yearning to know if their son or husband was still alive. These families, driven by grief and unwavering determination, initiated their own movement. The POW-MIA movement was born, stemming not from political ideology but from profound sorrow and resolute perseverance. They created the iconic black and white POW-MIA flag, a stark silhouette of a prisoner against the backdrop of a guard tower. It quickly became a powerful, ubiquitous symbol across the country. A silent yet potent reminder that not everyone had returned home. By the time the war concluded in 1975, the official number of Americans still unaccounted for exceeded 2,500. During Operation Homecoming in 1973, approximately 591 American POWs were released and flown home. It was a moment of profound celebration, but also of heartbreak. For thousands of families whose loved ones were not on that plane, the government asserted that many of the missing were likely dead, but some families adamantly refused to accept this explanation. There were persistent rumors, eyewitness accounts from other prisoners, whispers that some POWs had been relocated to other prisons, even into Laos, Cambodia, or even the Soviet Union. Over the years, some former POWs claimed to have heard American voices in unknown camps. Satellite photos were purported to show possible prison compounds in remote jungles. Others claimed to have seen carvings or coded symbols scratched into rocks or trees, left behind by someone desperately hoping to be found. None of these claims could be definitively confirmed. Yet they fueled the haunting question: were American soldiers still being held years after the war had officially ended? The U.S. government launched extensive investigations. Presidents and senators promised answers. Task forces traveled to Vietnam, and dozens of search missions meticulously attempted to recover remains, identify bones, and bring closure to the tormented families. Sometimes they succeeded: a helmet, a dog tag, a set of bones buried beneath the jungle soil. DNA testing facilitated the return of some soldiers home decades after they had vanished. But many families continue their agonizing wait. The Vietnamese government was not always cooperative. In the immediate years following the war, U.S.-Vietnam relations remained tense. It was not until the 1990s that the two countries initiated serious cooperation on locating missing soldiers. For the Vietnamese, the issue was equally complex. Hundreds of thousands of their own soldiers and civilians remained missing, mass graves were never marked, and entire regions had been devastated by relentless bombings. Their losses were immense. And many also lacked graves to visit. The profound pain of the war was shared, even by those who had been enemies. For those Americans who returned from captivity, the adjustment to civilian life was profoundly difficult. They had been absent for years, missing births, deaths, and entire chapters of life back home. Some were celebrated as heroes. Others were haunted by pervasive nightmares. The trauma of captivity never fully dissipated. Many silently carried their pain, but over time, they began to share their stories through books, interviews, and documentaries. They spoke of the small victories, like meticulously keeping their minds sharp with imaginary chess games. They spoke of the unbreakable friendships that sustained them. And they spoke of the overwhelming guilt they felt for surviving when others did not. As years passed, the government continued to address the issue. The Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, DPA, was established to locate and identify missing service members from past wars. Their mission is straightforward yet sacred: bring them all home. They meticulously excavate crash sites, interview witnesses, and utilize DNA to match remains with family members. It is a slow, painstaking process, but a profoundly sacred one. As of now, more than 1,500 American soldiers from the Vietnam War remain unaccounted for. Each one possesses a name, a story, and a family that has never relinquished hope. Every Memorial Day, every Veterans Day, their names are read aloud. The black POW MIA flag continues to fly over government buildings, military bases, and in small towns across the nation. It flies as a solemn promise that they will not be forgotten, and that America will continue the search, no matter how long it takes. This chapter of the Vietnam War serves as a powerful reminder that some wounds do not heal with peace treaties. They linger in the silence, in the agonizing waiting, in the empty chairs at dinner tables. The POWs and MIAs are more than mere numbers. They are fathers, brothers, sons, some barely out of high school when they vanished. Their legacy is one of extraordinary endurance, of unwavering bravery in the darkest of conditions, and of families who defiantly refuse to allow them to be erased from history. What they endured, and what their families continue to endure, is a potent reminder of the deeply personal cost of war. As we remember the Vietnam War, we must also remember them, not merely as prisoners or missing men, but as human beings who mattered. Because a war doesn't truly end until everyone comes home. Chapter 23: The War Comes Home. For many American soldiers, the Vietnam War was supposed to conclude the moment they boarded the plane home. They had endured the oppressive heat, the suffocating jungle, the incessant gunfire. They had survived ambushes, insidious landmines, and nights filled with paralyzing fear. But when they disembarked from that plane and set foot back on U.S. soil, another war began, a war no one had prepared them for. It was silent, invisible, yet just as terrifyingly real, the war within the mind. During World War II, soldiers returned home to triumphant parades and rapturous cheers. They were universally hailed as heroes. For Vietnam veterans, however, the welcome was often cold, sometimes even overtly hostile. Many Americans had turned decisively against the war. They were seething with anger, exhausted by the relentless stream of lies, and haunted by the televised images of burning villages and escalating body counts. In their collective anger, they conflated the war with the warrior. Some veterans were spat upon, derogatorily labeled baby killers, or ignored entirely by people they had once considered neighbors. They had not volunteered for this war. Most were drafted. They served because their country commanded them to, and now, back home, they felt like alienated strangers in their own land. No one seemed willing to discuss what they had witnessed, no one comprehended the nightmares, the terrifying flashbacks, or the sudden, inexplicable surges of fear that emerged from nowhere. Many, at the time, were unaware they were experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a condition not well understood in the 1970s. Back then, it was often dismissively referred to as combat fatigue, or shell shock. Some medical professionals even doubted its very existence. But it was undeniably real. Veterans would hear a car backfire and instinctively dive for cover. They would awaken screaming in the middle of the night, tormented by unseen horrors. They found it impossible to sit in restaurants unless their backs were securely against a wall. Loud noises, crowds, the distant whirring of helicopters, all could trigger overwhelming memories they desperately yearned to forget. Some found it impossible to hold down jobs. Relationships disintegrated. They withdrew, turning to alcohol or drugs as a desperate coping mechanism. They felt isolated, broken, and profoundly ashamed. The U.S. government possessed no adequate systems to provide them with assistance. The Veterans Affairs, VA, was underfunded, understaffed, and utterly overwhelmed. Counseling services were rare, waiting lists for treatment were interminably long. And many veterans were unaware that help was even available. By the 1980s, the profound and pervasive effects of the war had become impossible to ignore. A disproportionately high number of Vietnam veterans experienced homelessness. In city after city, veterans sought refuge in shelters, under bridges, and in alleyways, still bearing the immense psychological weight of a war that had ended years prior. They were in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. Many still wore old army jackets, and some still carried physical shrapnel embedded in their bodies. But the deeper wounds were the ones no X-ray could detect. It took an agonizingly long time for the country to truly listen. Veterans organizations, such as Vietnam Veterans of America, began to vociferously speak out. They marched, testified before Congress, and demanded recognition and comprehensive treatment for PTSD. Slowly, the government began to respond. In 1980, PTSD was officially recognized as a legitimate mental health diagnosis by the American Psychiatric Association. This pivotal recognition opened the door for critical research, the establishment of treatment programs, and the provision of benefits. However, it could not erase the years of pervasive silence. Veterans began to share their harrowing stories through books, interviews, and films. They spoke about the visceral experience of being a 19-year-old in an utterly incomprehensible environment, where a child could be a lookout, where the jungle could claim your life, and where you could lose your dearest friend in an instant. They spoke of overwhelming guilt, not merely survivor's guilt, but the profound burden of what they were forced to do to survive. Some had inadvertently killed civilians amidst the chaos of war. Others carried the indelible memory of moments when they were unable to save a friend. These were not subjects one could comfortably discuss at the dinner table. The trauma clung to them, shaping their lives. Some found a path to healing by helping others. They became counselors, mentors, writers, building communities of veterans who understood each other without needing explicit explanations. Others never found peace. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans was, and tragically remains, alarmingly high, even decades later. The memories do not fade. The war continues to live in the minds of many who fought it. Yet, this chapter is not solely about pain. It is also a testament to remarkable resilience. Some veterans returned home and went on to build fulfilling families, successful careers, and strong communities. They transformed their profound struggle into a source of strength, becoming powerful advocates for mental health awareness and for improved treatment for all veterans from all conflicts. They fought tirelessly for the right to be heard, to be understood, and to be remembered not merely as soldiers, but as human beings. In recent years, the country has made concerted efforts to atone. There are now enhanced resources for PTSD, including therapy, group counseling, crisis lines, and expanded veterans centers. New legislation continues to advocate for more comprehensive care and greater access to services. But the scars persist, on the land, on the heart, and in the quiet of the night when the jungle vividly returns behind closed eyes. Vietnam veterans imparted a harsh yet invaluable lesson to the nation: that the conclusion of a war is not marked by a peace treaty, but by how effectively we care for those who return. That a handshake and a perfunctory "thank you" are insufficient. True honor demands action, genuine help, unwavering support, and profound understanding. Today, as younger generations of veterans return home from Iraq and Afghanistan, many of the systems and support structures built in the aftermath of Vietnam are benefiting them. That is an enduring part of the Vietnam generation's legacy. They ensured that the pain they endured would not be needlessly repeated. They transmuted their suffering into a profound form of service, and that is something truly worth remembering. For those who served, the battle does not always cease on the battlefield. It persists in memory, in the soul, and along the long, often solitary, road of healing. We owe them more than medals. We owe them care, compassion, and the unvarnished truth. Chapter 24: The Ghosts of Indochina. When the Vietnam War officially ended in 1975, the direct fighting may have ceased. But the violence did not. Instead, it spread like a wildfire, leaping from one forest to another, while the world watched helicopters lift off rooftops in Saigon. Something even darker was unfolding just beyond the immediate headlines, in the neighboring nations of Cambodia and Laos. These two countries, inadvertently dragged into a war they never officially declared, would pay a terrible price, and decades later, they continued to be haunted by its lingering specters. Let's begin with Laos. Most Americans were unaware at the time, but Laos became the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs on this small, rural nation, an amount exceeding what was dropped during all of World War II. This clandestine campaign became known as the Secret War. Its objective was to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a crucial network of supply routes utilized by North Vietnam that snaked through Laos and Cambodia. However, the reality was brutal. Village after village was obliterated. Fields were scarred with craters, and families were torn apart. The U.S. was not merely bombing enemy positions, it was indiscriminately bombing entire landscapes. And not all of the bombs exploded. Approximately 30% of them failed to detonate, remaining buried in the soil, dormant and waiting. Even today, decades after the war, These unexploded ordnance, UXOs, continued to maim and kill farmers, children, and innocent civilians. A child picks up what appears to be a metal ball in a field and never returns home. A farmer strikes something with his hoe, and everything goes silent. In Laos, the war did not simply happen, it stubbornly stayed. To this day, people walk cautiously in certain regions. The very ground itself is perilous. The past is quite literally beneath their feet. Meanwhile, across the border in Cambodia, another nightmare was beginning. The U.S. had also initiated a massive bombing campaign there, commencing in 1969, targeting suspected Viet Cong sanctuaries. But as in Laos, civilians bore the brunt of the devastation. The countryside was ravaged, and refugees flooded cities like Phnom Penh. The very fabric of society began to unravel. Into this escalating chaos stepped a man named Pol Pot and his group, the Khmer Rouge. They pledged to rebuild Cambodia, to cast off foreign influence, and to revert to a pure, agrarian society. But what they ultimately constructed was a merciless killing machine. In 1975, as Saigon fell, the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh. They declared, Year Zero, a chilling decree that everything modern, everything Western, and everything connected to the past was to be utterly erased. They emptied the cities, forcing millions into the countryside. Families were ruthlessly separated. Eyeglasses, books, watches, any evidence of education or urban life, became instant death sentences. What followed was one of the most horrifying genocides of the 20th century. Between 1.5 to 2 million Cambodians, nearly a quarter of the entire population, perished between 1975 and 1979. People died from starvation, from forced labor, from rampant disease, and from execution. The Khmer Rouge established killing fields, remote sites where victims were brutally murdered with axes, hammers, and blunt tools to conserve precious bullets. Mass graves were filled with teachers, doctors, monks, and children, anyone who spoke a foreign language, anyone who dared to question the regime. And hauntingly, behind this horror, lay the shadows of the Vietnam War. The U.S. bombings had significantly weakened the Cambodian government, and the ensuing chaos created a power vacuum that the Khmer Rouge expertly exploited. A war that had commenced with the explicit aim of stopping communism inadvertently helped give birth to one of the most brutal communist regimes the world has ever witnessed. Eventually, in 1979, it was, ironically, Vietnam that intervened. Vietnamese forces invaded Cambodia, overthrew Pol Pot, and finally ended the Khmer Rouge's reign of terror. But the damage was already done. Entire generations lost, a country scarred beyond recognition. Today, the killing fields of Cambodia remain, not merely as historical sites, but as chilling graveyards of memory, skulls stacked in glass towers, bones emerging from the soil during the rainy season, clothing fibers still clinging to the earth. Cambodians continue to live with the profound trauma. Many survivors never received justice. Pol Pot died in 1998, never truly punished for his heinous crimes. And in Laos, the legacy of war is more silent, but no less deadly. UXO removal teams work tirelessly, meticulously combing the countryside with metal detectors. It will require decades, possibly centuries, to clear the land. In the interim, development is slow, and fear is a constant companion. A generation born after the war still suffers from its consequences. Children grow up learning how to identify a bomb, and farmers often purchase life insurance before venturing to work in their fields. It is a war that never truly left. And this is the hidden cost of the Vietnam War. It did not conclude in Saigon. It spilled across borders, across years, across generations. It fractured nations that were never part of the original conflict. It transformed civilians into casualties. It created ghosts, not merely of people, but of entire ways of life. Today, Cambodia and Laos are undertaking the arduous task of rebuilding. Tourists visit ancient temples, and cities hum with renewed energy. But underneath it all, the war lingers, in trauma, in memory, in the very soil, and in the pervasive silence. For far too long, this crucial part of the story was ignored, overshadowed by the indelible images of U.S. helicopters and fierce jungle battles. Forgotten by history books and headlines. But it matters. Because when war touches a region, it does not stop at the border, it does not end when the last soldier departs. It echoes in the remnants of bombs, and it is etched in the faces of survivors. The ghosts of Indochina are real, and they continue to whisper.